My sister stood up at my dead husband's graveside reception, holding her 1-year-old son on her hip, and told 41 guests that the boy in her arms was Richard's, and that she wanted $4 million by Friday. I had a fork of lemon cake halfway to my mouth. I set it down, wiped the corner of my lips with a cloth napkin that cost $11 to rent, and I said, all right. Then I had to fight a chuckle, because 8 days earlier I had watched a hospice nurse fold my husband's hands over his chest, and 6 years before that I had watched a surgeon confirm, in writing, that Richard Hartwell could never father another child as long as he lived. If you've ever had someone in your own family open their mouth and steal something from you in front of a room full of witnesses, comment below and tell me where you're watching from, and if you want to see exactly how far my sister was willing to go, stay to the end, because it did not stop at money. 3 things were happening at once that afternoon, and I need you to hold all 3, because they braid together by the end. The first is the obvious one. My sister Vanessa Cole was standing in the reception hall of the Gilded Whisk, the catering hall and bakery I had built with my own hands starting in a repurposed taco truck 14 years earlier, holding a folded document she called the will, announcing that her son Mason was my late husband's biological child, and demanding 50% of an $8 million estate that she had clearly never once helped build. The second thing, quieter, was a question I hadn't let myself ask out loud in 6 years. Why would Vanessa, who had never once visited Richard in the hospital, who sent a fruit basket instead of showing up when he was diagnosed, suddenly need money badly enough to invent a dead man's paternity in front of his widow? The third thing was smaller than both of those, and it was the one that actually scared me, because somewhere in that room was a woman named Dolores Reyes, Richard's home hospice nurse, standing near the dessert table in a cardigan 2 sizes too big, and Dolores was the only person alive who knew exactly what Vanessa had asked my husband to do 3 weeks before he died, and I did not yet know if Dolores was going to say a word. People assume when they hear a story like mine that the drama starts at the funeral. It doesn't. It starts 14 years before that, in a strip mall parking lot in Dayton, with a 1998 Ford box truck I bought for $600 from a man who was going to scrap it, and a family who thought baking wedding cakes for strangers was something you did until you found a real job. I need to tell you about my family the way it actually was, not the way it got repeated at Thanksgiving for 20 years, because the repeated version is the version Vanessa used to build her case, and until you understand how patient she was, you won't understand how satisfying it was to watch it collapse. My mother, Patricia Whitfield, raised 2 daughters 18 months apart in a rented duplex on the wrong side of a school district line, which meant we spent our whole childhood watching kids from the right side of that line get things we didn't. Patricia handled this the way a lot of tired, proud women handle scarcity. She picked a favorite, and she picked early, and she picked Vanessa. It wasn't cruelty, not exactly, not at first. Vanessa was the pretty one, the one who won the 4th grade spelling bee, the one whose report cards Patricia photocopied and mailed to relatives. I was the one who liked being alone in the kitchen, rolling out dough on wax paper on the counter, because the kitchen was the one room in that duplex where nobody was comparing me to anybody. My grandmother, Loretta, had taught me to bake before she died, when I was 9, and after she was gone, baking became the thing I did instead of talking, which suited everybody fine, because Vanessa was loud enough to fill any room I left silent. By the time we were teenagers, the pattern had a name in my head, even if I never said it out loud. Vanessa performed, and I produced. Vanessa got the solo in the choir concert. I made the cupcakes for the reception after. 320 of them, lemon and chocolate, because someone had to and nobody else offered. Vanessa got a scholarship essay published in the local paper. I got asked, at 16, to make the cake for my own aunt's 40th birthday, and I said yes, and it turned out well, and nobody in my family thought to ask where a 16-year-old had learned fondant work that clean. They just ate it and asked if there'd be more at Christmas. I want to be precise about this, because precision is the whole point of what I'm about to show you. I am not telling you my sister was born a villain. I'm telling you that for 20-some years, my family built a story where Vanessa was the one worth investing in, and I was the reliable one, the free labor, the girl who didn't need anything because she never asked for anything. And when you build that story long enough, the person living inside the free labor role stops being a person to everyone else. She becomes a resource, and resources don't get a cut when the harvest comes in. They just get used again next season. I met Richard Hartwell when I was 26, at a farmer's market in Columbus where I was selling hand pies out of a folding table because the box truck's oven had died the week before and I couldn't afford the repair. He bought 4 pies, came back an hour later and bought 6 more. And on his third trip to my table, he finally admitted he didn't even like hand pies that much. He just wanted an excuse to keep talking to me. Richard was 11 years older than me, already running a modest commercial real estate firm his father had started, quiet in the way that made loud rooms nervous around him, and the first time he came to my mother's house for dinner, Patricia spent the entire evening asking him questions about his firm's revenue, and exactly 0 questions about what he thought of me. Vanessa, who was 24 then and between jobs, sat across the table and laughed at every one of his jokes 11 seconds too long. I noticed. I filed it away. I did not yet know how long a file like that could sit before someone opened it again. Richard and I married 2 years later, in a backyard, with a cake I made myself at 1 in the morning the night before because I didn't trust anyone else to do it right. And that detail matters more than it sounds like it should, because it's the first thread in a rope Vanessa would later try to use to hang me. From the very beginning of our marriage, Richard believed in me more specifically and more stubbornly than anyone else ever had. He was the one who sat across from me at our kitchen table with a legal pad and said, "You're not selling pies out of a truck for the rest of your life, Diane. You're building something. Let's build it on paper first." He co-signed the loan on our first real commercial kitchen. He negotiated our first lease. But, and this is the part my family conveniently forgot every single time they told this story for the next 13 years. Every recipe, every menu, every hire, every 4 in the morning decision about whether the lavender buttercream was too floral for a Midwestern wedding crowd, that was mine. Richard built the scaffolding, I built the building. We lost our son when I was 31. I'm not going to spend long on this because it isn't the part of the story that's for public consumption, but I need you to know it happened because it is the hinge everything else swings on. Caleb Hartwell lived for 6 days. He was born 11 weeks early, and there was a heart defect the doctors hadn't caught in time. And on the 7th day of his life, we signed papers instead of bringing him home. Richard did not speak for 3 days afterward. On the 4th day, he asked me to drive him to a clinic 40 minutes outside the city, and he had a vasectomy, and when I asked him why, right there in the parking lot, he said, "I can't survive hoping for that again." I need this door closed, Diane. Not maybe closed. Closed. I held his hand through the consultation. I signed as his emergency contact on the intake form. I drove him home afterward and made him soup he didn't eat. I am telling you this so that when you hear, later, exactly how confidently Vanessa stood up in front of 41 people and said her son was Richard's, you understand precisely how impossible that sentence was, and precisely how long I had been carrying the private, unglamorous proof of its impossibility, folded up in a manila envelope in a fireproof box in my closet, next to Caleb's hospital bracelet. The business did not stop growing just because our family did. If anything, it grew faster, because grief made me terrifyingly efficient. I opened the Gilded Whisk's first storefront 18 months after Caleb died, on a stretch of Main Street that everyone told me was a mistake, across from a hardware store that had been closed for 2 years. I built the catering side out of that storefront kitchen, then added the events hall 4 years after that, then a second location, then a wholesale line that put our pastries into 6 regional grocery chains. By the time Richard was diagnosed, the year I turned 41, the Gilded Whisk employed 38 people and did just under $8 million a year across the catering, retail, and wholesale arms combined, and every single line of that revenue could be traced back to a recipe I had personally developed, tested, and refined at our kitchen table with Richard, timing my proofing on his phone, because I refused to buy a proper kitchen timer for 11 years out of pure stubbornness. And here is the detail that will matter enormously later, so hold on to it. Richard restructured our estate the year after his diagnosis, on the advice of an attorney named Warren Coates, specifically so that the Gilded Whisk, the business, the brand, the recipes, all of it, would pass entirely and irrevocably to me, separate from the rest of our joint estate, regardless of anything that happened with his family afterward. He told me, sitting in Warren's office with an IV port still taped under his shirt sleeve from that morning's infusion, "Nobody gets to say later that this was ours, plural, when it was built by you, singular. I want that in writing where nobody can argue with it." I remember thinking at the time that he was being needlessly formal, almost paranoid. I did not yet know that in 18 months I would understand exactly why he'd insisted. Vanessa's life, over those same 14 years, took a different shape. She married a man named Gary Cole when she was 29, a pleasant, soft-spoken insurance adjuster, who I want to be fair to, because Gary is not the villain of this story. Gary is more like weather that happens to a person. something Vanessa stood under and let happen to her, rather than something she chose. Vanessa tried a series of businesses over the years that I watched from a polite, exhausted distance. A boutique that sold curated home goods and closed after 14 months. A multi-level marketing skincare venture that she was extremely, aggressively certain would make her a six-figure income within a year. An Etsy shop selling hand-lettered nursery signs that never quite covered the cost of the vinyl cutter she'd bought on a payment plan. Each of these ventures, without fail, generated a phone call to me within its first 90 days. Always some version of the same request. Could I look at her business plan? Could I introduce her to my wholesale contacts? Could Richard maybe just co-sign something small? Nothing crazy, just to get her started the way he'd gotten me started. I want to be honest about something uncomfortable. For years, I said yes more than I should have. I sourced a supplier for her skincare boxes at cost. I let her sell her nursery signs at 3 of my events, gave her table space for free, told clients she was a talented local artist, when in truth her lettering was uneven and her margins didn't work. I did this because some old, stubborn part of me still wanted my mother to look at Vanessa and me and see two daughters who helped each other, instead of one daughter who had built something and one daughter who kept almost building something and never landing. What I did not realize, not fully, not until Dolores Reyes sat me down 11 weeks after the funeral and told me what she'd overheard in Richard's hospital room, was that Vanessa had spent those same 14 years constructing a version of our shared history where she was quietly, generously essential to my success, and where I owed her a debt she intended, eventually, to collect in full. She told this story slowly, in small pieces, at the kinds of events where nobody fact-checks anything, because fact-checking your sister-in-law at your own baby shower feels rude. At my mother's 70th birthday dinner, 4 years before Richard died, I heard Vanessa tell my cousin Brianna Foss, with total conviction, "You know I introduced Diane to the woman who did our first big catering contract, right? The medical conference?" Diane always forgets that part. I had never in my life heard of this introduction. I had booked that medical conference contract myself, cold, after 3 months of unreturned emails and one lucky conversation with a facilities manager at a hotel bar. But Brianna nodded along because why would you doubt a woman describing her own sister's business history at a birthday dinner? And the story went into the family record as fact, the way most family myths do. Not because anyone checked it, but because nobody had a reason to. At Thanksgiving, the year Vanessa's boutique closed, I heard her tell my mother, "I gave Diane the original lavender honey recipe, you know, before the wedding cake line even started. She just never puts my name on anything." This was again entirely invented. I developed that recipe alone over 6 failed batches in the summer after Caleb died, when working with lavender was one of the only things that made the inside of my chest feel survivable for an afternoon. But Patricia repeated it to a neighbor 2 weeks later as an established fact. My girls built that business together, really. And I remember standing in my mother's kitchen doorway, hearing that sentence and feeling something in me go very still and very cold. Because I understood, in that moment, that Vanessa wasn't misremembering. She was laying track. She was building, patiently, brick by small, deniable brick. A story in which she had contributed enough to the gilded whisk that someday, if she ever needed to, she could plausibly claim a piece of it. I told Richard about it, once, on our back porch, and he said something I've turned over in my head 1,000 times since. People don't usually lie about the past unless they're planning something for the future. Keep records, Diane. Not because you're paranoid, because you're smart. I laughed it off at the time. I did not laugh it off later, when I understood exactly how right he had been, and exactly how much of my careful record-keeping, old invoices, old contracts, old text messages, 14 years of a paper trail I'd kept out of nothing more than administrative habit, was about to become the only thing standing between me and losing half of what I had built to a woman who had never once picked up a whisk in my kitchen. Then there was my mother's role in all of this, which deserves its own honest accounting, because Patricia Whitfield never once, in 14 years, stole a dollar or told an outright lie about my business. What Patricia did, consistently, reliably, was smaller and in some ways more corrosive. She agreed with whoever was in the room. At my dinner table, she praised my cooking and asked pointed questions about whether I was working too hard, whether it was really worth the toll on my marriage. At Vanessa's dinner table, 3 weeks later, she praised Vanessa's vision and told the same guests that Vanessa had always had the bigger dreams. Honestly, Diane just likes to keep her head down. Patricia's fixed trait, if I had to name it in one word, was flattery. Not of one daughter over the other exactly, but of whoever's approval was currently in the room to give. She wanted peace so badly and so reflexively that she would say whatever kept the immediate temperature low, and she never once seemed to notice, or care, that flattering both sides of a growing lie is its own kind of lie. Gary Cole's trait was cowardice, plain and simple. And I don't say that with much heat anymore, because I've come to think Gary was as trapped by Vanessa's momentum as anyone else. At every family gathering for a decade, I watched Gary hear his wife say something untrue, watched something flicker behind his eyes that might have been discomfort, and watched him say nothing, refill his plate, ask someone about the football game instead. He wasn't cruel, he was simply never once, in 10 years, willing to spend a single ounce of social capital contradicting his wife in front of her family, even when contradicting her would have cost him nothing but a moment of awkwardness. And then there was my cousin Brianna Foss, 29, a hygienist who posted her outfits on social media with more captions than the outfits probably deserved, whose fixed trait was a vanity so total it left almost no room in her for curiosity about anyone else's inner life. Brianna's contribution to the machine Vanessa was quietly building was simpler than Patricia's or Gary's. She repeated things. She was the family town crier, the person who took whatever story she'd heard at one gathering and delivered it, embellished, at the next, always positioning herself as being in the know, always more interested in being the one with the update than in whether the update was true. I'm laying all of this out for you not because family dysfunction by itself is unusual. Most families have some version of a Patricia, a Gary, a Brianna, but because Vanessa needed exactly these three people functioning exactly this way for 14 years in order for her final move to work at all. She needed a mother who would repeat her version of events as unquestioned fact. She needed a husband who would never once undercut her in front of witnesses. And she needed a cousin who would spread whatever narrative Vanessa planted, fast, wide, and with total unearned confidence. Without that infrastructure, her claim at my husband's funeral reception would have lasted about 4 seconds before someone in the room said, out loud, "Wait, that doesn't sound right." With it, she nearly got away with it in front of 41 witnesses who had spent a decade being trained, gently and repeatedly, to believe her first. I want to walk you through how the credit stealing actually escalated, because it didn't happen all at once. It happened the way water finds a crack in a foundation, slowly, then suddenly, then it's the whole basement. It started small enough that I genuinely didn't register it as a pattern for the first year or two. At my 35th birthday, which Vanessa hosted at her house, a kindness I appreciated at the time, she stood up with a glass of Prosecco and gave a toast that I still remember almost word for word, because something about it snagged. To my sister, she said, who I basically dragged into baking in the first place, because Lord knows she needed something to do with all that nervous energy. The room laughed. I laughed too because it was framed as a joke, warm, sisterly, the kind of gentle exaggeration people expect at a birthday toast. But it wasn't a joke to Vanessa. I understood that later. It was a seed, planted in a room full of people who would, over the following decade, water it without ever noticing they were doing so. 18 months after that, at a 4th of July barbecue at my mother's, I overheard Vanessa telling a neighbor named the Petrocellis, a couple I barely knew, an entire fabricated origin story for the Gilded Whisk. Honestly, she said, swirling ice in a plastic cup, it started as kind of our project. I used to help her test recipes on weekends, back when it was just the truck. She's better at the day-to-day now, obviously, but the early stuff, the DNA of the brand, that was really both of us. Mr. Petrocelli nodded, impressed, and said something about how nice it was that sisters could build something together. I stood 8 feet away, holding a bowl of potato salad I'd made from scratch, at 4 in the morning, alone, the way I made everything, and I said nothing, because contradicting her felt petty in the moment, felt like making a scene over a compliment she'd basically paid herself at a barbecue nobody would remember by August. That's the trap if you've never lived inside it. Each individual theft is small enough to swallow. It's only in aggregate, only when you finally sit down and count them, that you understand how much has actually been taken. By the time Richard and I opened the second Gilded Whisk location, 6 years before he died, Vanessa's version of our shared history had calcified into something she told with total, unblinking confidence, even in front of me. At the ribbon cutting for that second location, an event with a local news crew, 40 guests, and my mother in the front row wearing a corsage I'd pinned on her myself that morning, Vanessa walked up to the reporter afterward, while I was still mid-interview about our expansion plans, and I watched her introduce herself as Diane's sister and original business partner. The reporter, a young woman named Kayla Ruiz, wrote it down. It ran in the local paper 2 days later, a caption under a photo of the ribbon cutting that read, Diane Hartwell, Center, with sister and early business partner Vanessa Cole. I called the paper. I asked for a correction. They ran a small one, a week later, on page 9, that maybe 11 people read. Vanessa, meanwhile, framed the original clipping, the wrong one, and hung it in her hallway where it stayed for the next 6 years, greeting every guest who walked through her front door with a lie printed in newsprint, which is a kind of lie that feels more true to people than any other kind, because it looked official. I confronted her about it exactly once, the week the article ran, standing in her kitchen while Gary made himself scarce in the garage. I said, Vanessa, you were not my business partner. You've never once worked a shift, never signed a contract, never invested $1. I need you to stop telling people that. And Vanessa did something I would come to recognize as her signature move over the following years. She didn't deny it exactly, and she didn't apologize. She reframed it as an attack on her. Wow, she said, setting down the dish towel she'd been folding. I mentioned I supported you starting out, and suddenly I'm the villain. This is exactly why I don't talk to you about anything real anymore, Diane. You get so defensive the second anyone else gets any credit for anything. She left the kitchen. I stood there holding an unspoken apology I somehow now owed her, for the crime of asking her to stop lying about me in a newspaper. I told this story to my mother a few days later, hoping for backup. Patricia's response was, verbatim, I just think it would be nicer if you two could find a way to both feel proud of what's happened, instead of arguing over who gets the credit. I remember standing in my mother's living room understanding, with total clarity for maybe the first time, that my family did not experience Vanessa's fabrications as fabrications. They experienced them as a slightly exaggerated but essentially harmless family story, and any correction I offered registered to them not as truth-telling, but as me being difficult, competitive, ungenerous with my own sister. This is, I want to say clearly, one of the more effective mechanisms a person like Vanessa has. She doesn't need everyone to believe her outright. She only needs enough people to find correcting her more socially costly than letting it slide, and eventually the slide becomes the record. The wholesale deal with the regional grocery chain, 4 years before Richard died, is where the pattern moved from annoying to genuinely dangerous, because that was the first time Vanessa's version of events touched actual paperwork. I had spent 5 months negotiating that contract myself, flying to 2 different buyer meetings, developing 3 shelf-stable pastry lines that could survive distribution without losing quality. A technical problem that took me the better part of a year to solve on my own in a rented commercial kitchen at 2 in the morning, while Richard slept upstairs. When the deal finally closed, Vanessa asked, casually, over a family dinner, whether our wholesale line, her word, our, might have room for a small batch of her nursery sign-adjacent gift boxes to be bundled in as a promotional add-on. I said no, gently, explaining that the grocery chain's contract was extremely specific about product categories and quality certifications neither her signs nor any hypothetical food item she might produce would meet. She didn't argue in the moment. But 3 weeks later, my mother mentioned, almost in passing, that Vanessa had told her the grocery deal fell through because Diane wouldn't let anyone else in on it, even family, even for something small. Which was not merely false, it was a complete fabrication of an event that never happened, describing a rejection I'd never delivered for a request that had nothing to do with what actually got rejected. I started keeping records after that, not because I suspected, yet the scale of what Vanessa was ultimately capable of, but because some quiet, self-protective animal instinct told me that a person who fabricates a newspaper quote and a rejected business deal within the span of a few years is a person who might, eventually, fabricate something with real stakes attached. I bought a small fireproof lockbox. I started saving screenshots of text messages where Vanessa asked for things and I said no, or where she claimed credit for something I could disprove with a date-stamped invoice. I saved the original, uncorrected newspaper clipping alongside the correction the paper eventually ran. I did not know, buying that lockbox, that I was building the exact archive that would save me 6 years later. I only knew that something in my chest had started keeping score, quietly, the way you do when you've learned that being believed in your own family is not a given. It's a thing you sometimes have to prove. The trait that made Brianna dangerous wasn't malice, it was velocity. Whatever Vanessa said at one gathering, Brianna delivered to the next one within days, dressed up in her own enthusiastic embellishment. The newspaper clipping story became, by the time it reached my Aunt Susan 2 states away, Vanessa basically ran the whole marketing side before Diane pushed her out. The nursery sign rejection became, in Brianna's retelling at a cousin's baby shower, Diane's gotten kind of controlling since the business took off. Honestly, she barely lets Vanessa near any of it anymore. Each retelling added a little venom that hadn't been in the original, the way a story does when it passes through someone whose real interest is not accuracy but relevance. The electric little thrill of being the person who has the update. Gary's cowardice showed up most clearly the one time I tried to get a straight answer out of a witness. At a Labor Day cookout, roughly 5 years before Richard's diagnosis, I asked Gary directly, in front of Vanessa, "Gary, be honest. Did Vanessa ever work a single shift at any Gilded Whisk location? Ever touch a contract? I'm not trying to start anything, I just want to know if I'm remembering wrong." There was a silence that lasted maybe 4 full seconds, an eternity at a cookout. Gary looked at his paper plate. He looked at Vanessa. He said, I wasn't really around for the early days, so... It was true, technically, and it was also a complete abdication of a question he absolutely knew the answer to, because Gary had been dating Vanessa for 2 of those early years and knew perfectly well she'd never so much as visited the original food truck. His cowardice wasn't a single dramatic betrayal. It was this, over and over, for a decade. Small, private knowledge of the truth, and a total unwillingness to spend it on my behalf when it might have cost him 5 uncomfortable seconds with his wife. By the time Richard was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, the pattern had a rhythm to it that I could almost predict. Something true would happen, Vanessa would retell it with herself inserted into a more central role, Patricia would nod along to keep the peace, Gary would say nothing, and Brianna would carry the new version to whoever hadn't heard it yet, usually within 72 hours. I want to give you 2 more scenes from this period, because they matter for what comes later and because I think it's important you understand that Vanessa's pattern didn't pause for my husband's illness. If anything, it sharpened. 6 weeks after Richard's diagnosis, my mother hosted what she called a family strength dinner, a phrase I still find almost unbearably sad in retrospect, because what it actually was, functionally, was an evening where Vanessa positioned herself as the family's emotional center of gravity during a crisis that was not in fact happening to her. She arrived with a casserole she'd clearly bought from a grocery store and repackaged into her own dish. Something I noticed because I recognized the specific sear pattern on the chicken from a chain restaurant 2 towns over. She stood in my mother's kitchen and said, loudly enough for the whole downstairs to hear, "I told Richard's doctor I want to be looped in on everything. Diane's going to need someone managing logistics while she runs the business. And honestly, I think I'm the natural person for that, since I already know the business inside and out." Nobody in the room asked her what, specifically, about the business she knew inside and out. Patricia said, "That's so generous of you, sweetheart." Brianna posted a story that night with a candle emoji and the caption, "Praying for my family through this scary time," tagging Vanessa, not me, not Richard. I sat at that dinner and watched my sister audition, in real time, for the role of the person who had suffered most from my husband's diagnosis. And I understood, with a cold clarity I hadn't felt before, that Vanessa did not experience other people's crises as things that happened to those people. She experienced them as stages, and she was always instinctively looking for the best spot to stand on one. The second scene happened 4 months later, at a hospital, which is a setting I still can't fully separate from what happened there. Richard was 3 days into a rough round of chemotherapy, nauseated, thin in a way that still catches in my throat to describe, and Vanessa showed up unannounced with Mason, who was newborn then, barely 6 weeks old. She sat in the vinyl chair beside Richard's bed, angled her body and the baby so that anyone walking past the open door would see a tender little tableau. Sick uncle, adoring aunt, sweet baby. And she stayed for exactly 19 minutes, long enough to take 4 photographs on her phone, one of which she posted that evening with the caption, "Richard got to meet his nephew today. Precious moments." A caption that generated 41 comments about resilience and family and the preciousness of time, not one of which came from the person who had actually been in that room managing Richard's anti-nausea medication schedule for the preceding 11 hours, which was me. I am telling you about that photograph specifically because 11 months later, at the funeral reception, Vanessa would gesture toward a printed, framed copy of that exact image, sitting on an easel near the guest book, and use it as visual evidence, in front of 41 people, that Richard and Mason had a real bond, a real connection. Anyone who saw them together could feel it. She had staged the evidence 11 months before she needed it. She had, in the most literal sense, been building her exhibit while the rest of us thought she was simply, if a little performatively, showing up for family. There's a version of this story where I tell you I saw it coming, where some sharp instinct in me clocked the photograph, the caption, the 19 minutes, and understood immediately what they were for. That version isn't true, and I won't pretend it is. What I actually felt standing in that hospital hallway watching Vanessa post the photo from the waiting room chairs was mostly exhaustion and a familiar, worn smooth irritation. The kind you develop toward a family member's behavior after enough years that you've stopped expecting it to change and started simply budgeting for it. The way you budget for a leaky faucet you've decided isn't worth the plumber. I did not yet understand that this particular leak was going to become, in less than a year, a flood. Richard died on a Tuesday morning in March, 17 months after his diagnosis, in a hospice room with soft yellow light and a window that looked out on a dogwood tree just starting to bud. Dolores Reyes, his hospice nurse for the final 11 weeks, was the one who found his pulse gone at 6:14 in the morning, and she was the one who sat with me for 40 minutes afterward while I made phone calls, because I did not want to be alone in that room once it started filling with other people's grief on top of my own. I want to introduce Dolores properly here, because everything that comes later hinges on the fact that almost nobody in my family thought Dolores mattered enough to notice. Dolores was 58, a decade into hospice nursing after 20 years in a hospital oncology ward, a woman who wore her hair in a single gray braid and spoke in a low, unhurried voice that had a way of making even terrible news feel survivable. She had been present for the worst 11 weeks of my life in a way almost nobody in my extended family had been present for anything. And my family, true to form, treated her the way people often treat hospice staff, with a distant, grateful politeness that never once extended to actually learning her last name. At the one family gathering Dolores attended, a small pre-funeral gathering at our house the week before Richard died, Vanessa spoke to her exactly once, to ask if she could refill a water pitcher, and otherwise moved through the room as though Dolores were part of the furniture, a useful, unremarkable fixture of Richard's final weeks, rather than a person who was, in fact, the single most informed witness in the entire house. This turned out to be Vanessa's first real mistake. She had spent 14 years managing the perceptions of my mother, my cousin, my husband's business associates, casual acquaintances at ribbon cuttings. She had never once considered that the quiet woman in scrubs refilling water pitchers might be listening, remembering, and, eventually, deciding she had had enough. 3 weeks before Richard died, on a Thursday afternoon when I had gone home for 2 hours to shower and sleep on Dolores's insistence, Vanessa let herself into Richard's hospice room alone. Dolores was in the hallway restocking supplies, close enough to hear through the door, which Vanessa had not fully closed, and what Dolores heard, standing very still with a stack of folded linens in her arms, was my sister's voice, pitched low and urgent, saying something Dolores would later repeat to me almost word for word, because it had lodged itself in her memory the way only truly wrong things do. Vanessa said, "Richard, listen to me. You don't have to do anything big. You don't even have to say it's true out loud to anyone but a lawyer. Just don't correct it if it comes up. That's all I'm asking. Just let it be unclear. For Mason's sake, he deserves a chance at something. And Gary and I are drowning, Richard. We are actually drowning." Dolores said Richard's response was weak, slurred with medication, but unmistakable. He said, "No. Vanessa, no. That's not, no." And then, according to Dolores, he said something that broke her heart to repeat to me later. "Diane will know. She'll always know. Don't do this to her too." Dolores did not go into that room. She has told me since that she has replayed that decision more times than she can count, wondering if she should have interrupted, should have made her presence known immediately instead of finishing the hallway restock first, out of some instinct not to embarrass a dying man's family in his final weeks. What she did instead was write down on the back of a supply inventory sheet the date, the time, and as close to verbatim as she could manage, what she had heard, because 20 years of hospice work had taught her that families sometimes needed a record of things nobody else would believe happened in a room with the door almost closed. She folded that sheet of paper into her scrub pocket, and she did not tell me, not that day, not for 11 more weeks, because Richard was still alive, and it was not her story to tell, while there was still a chance it wouldn't matter. I need you to sit in that room with me for a moment. The room I didn't even know I'd been in until 11 weeks later, because it recontextualizes everything about the day of the funeral reception. My sister did not simply seize an opportunity after Richard died. She tried to manufacture the opportunity while he was still breathing, while I was showering at home for the first time in 4 days, while a hospice nurse folded linens close enough to hear a woman ask a dying man to let a lie stand uncorrected for the sake of money. Richard said no. Weak, sedated, days from the end of his life, my husband still found the strength to refuse her, and the last coherent thing Dolores heard him say on the subject was my name, and a promise that I would know the truth even if nobody else was ever told. If you're still with me, I want to pause here, because we're about a third of the way through what happened, and I know some of you are already furious on my behalf, which I appreciate more than I can say. If you've ever sat with someone through the worst weeks of their life, and then watched another family member try to extract something from that same suffering, hit that subscribe button now, because what Vanessa did at that birthday party wasn't even the worst thing she tried, and I promise you the ending is worth staying for. Drop a comment telling me the moment in this story so far that made your stomach turn the most, because I read every single one, and I want to know if it landed the way it landed for me. I found out about the hallway conversation 11 weeks after the funeral, on a Saturday afternoon, when Dolores Reyes called me out of nowhere and asked if she could come by. I assumed, at first, that she wanted to check in the way hospice staff sometimes do, a courtesy call to a widow a few months out. Instead, she sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Richard had once spread out a legal pad and told me I was building something worth building on paper, and she took a folded, slightly worn piece of paper out of her purse, a supply inventory sheet with handwriting crammed into the margins, and she told me what she had heard through that hospice door 11 weeks earlier. She told me she'd sat on it because Richard was alive when it happened and she didn't feel it was her place, and then, once he'd died, because she'd been unsure whether it was her place even then, whether a nurse crossing that line was appropriate, professional, wanted. What had finally changed her mind, she told me, was seeing the framed hospital photograph at the funeral reception, the one of Vanessa and baby Mason at Richard's bedside, propped on an easel near the guest book, like evidence at a trial nobody else knew was happening. Dolores said she'd stood near that easel for almost a full minute, and something in her, some old, hard-won hospice nurse conviction about what the dying deserve and what the living owe them, had simply refused to let the lie stand unchallenged any longer. I want to tell you honestly what I felt, sitting at that table with Dolores's careful, decades-old handwriting in front of me. It wasn't shock, not exactly. Some part of me, the part that had bought a fireproof lockbox 6 years earlier, had been braced for something like this for a long time, without knowing its exact shape. What I felt, mostly, underneath the grief that never really left the room during that entire period of my life, was a kind of grim, exhausted clarity. My sister had watched her nephew's uncle die and, instead of grieving him, had tried to negotiate a business deal out of his final coherent weeks. And Richard, sick, sedated, days from the end, had spent some of his very last strength protecting me from a lie he wouldn't even be alive to help me fight. I asked Dolores if she would be willing to write down a formal, signed statement of what she'd heard, dated and notarized, and I asked if she would be willing to keep the original supply sheet, exactly as it was, somewhere safe. She said yes to both without hesitation. I did not at that point know I would eventually need either document read aloud in a room full of my family's oldest friends. I only knew that for the first time in 11 weeks, I had something concrete to hold on to that wasn't just grief. I spent the next several weeks doing something I hadn't let myself do in 14 years, which was actually investigate my sister's finances, quietly, using nothing more sophisticated than public records, a few careful conversations with people who owed me no particular loyalty to Vanessa, and the kind of pattern recognition that runs a business, teaches you whether you want it to or not. What I found explained, finally, the timing of everything. Gary had lost his job as an insurance adjuster 14 months before Richard's funeral, quietly, without either of them mentioning it to the wider family, a fact I only confirmed by calling his old office under the pretense of a policy question and being told, politely, that Mr. Cole was no longer with the company. Vanessa's most recent venture, a wellness coaching certification business she'd sunk savings into the year before, had folded within 6 months, and court records showed a small claims judgment against her from a printing company she'd never paid for marketing materials, $4,112 plus interest. Their house, a modest 3-bedroom in a subdivision 20 minutes from mine, had a second mortgage taken out 9 months before Richard's diagnosis, and property records showed a pending notice of default filed with the county the same month Richard entered hospice care. My sister was not simply envious. In other words, in the diffuse, atmospheric way she'd been envious for most of our adult lives. She was, by the time Richard was dying, 3 months from losing her house, with a husband quietly unemployed and a certification business that had cost more than it earned, and she was watching her sister's husband, a man worth, on paper, roughly $8 million, dying slowly enough that there was time to plan, and fast enough that there wasn't time to plan carefully. I don't say any of this to generate sympathy for what she did next. I say it because I think it matters. For anyone who's ever wondered how a person justifies something this cruel to themselves, that the answer is rarely simple villainy. Vanessa did not wake up one day and decide to be evil. She spent 14 years building a story in which she deserved more credit than she'd earned, and then, faced with real financial catastrophe, she reached for the biggest, cruelest version of that story available to her, because by then, reaching for undeserved credit was the only muscle she'd ever really trained. There's an older layer to this, too. One Dolores helped me understand only because she'd overheard fragments of it in that same hospice hallway. In a second, shorter conversation a week after the first, one Vanessa had with Gary in the hospice family lounge, not knowing Dolores was refilling the coffee station 6 feet away. Vanessa told Gary, that day something close to this. I have spent my entire life watching Diane get everything handed to her because she found the one thing she was good at early, and everyone just let her run with it. Nobody ever let me run with anything. This is the first real chance I've had in years to get something that's actually mine, and I am not going to feel guilty about taking it. I want to sit with that sentence for a moment, because I think it's the truest thing Vanessa said in the entire 11 weeks Dolores was quietly, painfully privy to her private conversations. My sister did not believe she was stealing. She believed, with total sincerity, that she was finally collecting on a debt the universe owed her, a debt she had convinced herself I somehow represented. It would be easy, and satisfying in a shallow way, to tell you Vanessa was simply lying, cynically, with full awareness of her own cruelty. I don't think that's accurate, and I think the more accurate version is more disturbing. I think Vanessa had told the story of her own underdog resentment so many times, for so many years, to a family primed to nod along, that by the time real desperation arrived, she genuinely could not distinguish between what she deserved and what she was owed. That distinction is the whole difference between a person and a predator, and somewhere along the way, my sister lost the ability to feel it. The birthday party itself, Mason's first, the party where I first heard the claim out loud in front of witnesses, happened 9 days after Richard's funeral, which tells you something on its own about how little Vanessa was willing to let grief slow her down. My mother had suggested postponing it, gently, and Vanessa had insisted, with an urgency that, in retrospect, I understand completely, that life doesn't stop and Mason deserves his celebration. And honestly, I think we could all use something joyful right now. I attended because not attending would have generated a different, equally exhausting family narrative. One where I was too cold, too withdrawn, too consumed by my own grief to celebrate a 1-year-old's birthday. And I was tired, so tired, of managing my family's narratives about me. The party was at Vanessa and Gary's house, 41 guests by my later count, checking the sign-in sheet Vanessa had insisted on for the party favor drawing. A detail so aggressively normal it makes the rest of what happened feel almost surreal in retrospect. There was a bounce house rented for children who mostly ignored it, a taco bar catered from a chain restaurant, a dessert table with a sheet cake Vanessa had ordered from a grocery store bakery, iced in a shade of blue that didn't quite match the balloons, a detail I noticed with the automatic, professional part of my brain that never fully turns off even in grief. The framed hospital photograph sat on a small easel near the guest book, exactly where I'd later understand she'd staged it, alongside a second, newer photograph I hadn't seen before, Richard, badly thin, propped up in his hospice bed, with Mason placed carefully on his lap, taken, I would later confirm through Dolores's careful records. On a day I hadn't been in the room, the one day in 11 weeks I'd left Richard alone with a family member for more than 20 minutes, trusting, foolishly it turned out, that even Vanessa wouldn't exploit a dying man's exhaustion for a photograph. I ate my lemon cake. I made small talk with my mother about the weather. I did not know, sitting in a folding chair with a paper plate balanced on my knee, that Vanessa had spent the entire morning rehearsing what she was about to say. That she had, according to a conversation Brianna would later admit to under considerably less pressure than she expected, actually practiced the phrase, "As his inheritance I demand 50%, out loud in her bathroom mirror the night before, because she wanted it to land with the precision of something legally official rather than the desperate grab it actually was. She stood up between the taco bar and the dessert table, tapped a fork against her Prosecco glass. Prosecco. At a 1-year-old's birthday party, another small detail that told you everything about who this event was actually for, and waited until the 41 of us quieted down, the way a room quiets for a toast. "I want to say something," she began, and her voice had a practiced tremor in it that I recognized, distantly, from every performance she'd given at every family gathering for 30 years. This has been such a hard month for our family. Losing Richard was devastating for all of us. But I think it's time we're honest about something, because I don't think it's fair to keep pretending, especially not for Mason's sake. She reached down and lifted Mason onto her hip, angling him toward the room the exact same way she'd angled him in that hospital photograph 11 months earlier. "This boy is your husband's son," she said, looking directly at me across 41 silent guests. "I know how that sounds, I know it's a lot, but I've known for a while, and Richard knew too, and I think in his final months he wanted to make things right, which is why, as his inheritance, I am asking for 50% of your $8 million estate. I even have the will." She lifted a folded document from her bag, held it up like a flag, and the room, I promise you, made a sound I will never fully be able to describe. A collective intake of breath from 41 people who had spent a decade being trained to believe her first and ask questions later. I looked at the document in her hand from 12 feet away and understood immediately it could not be an actual will. Because Richard's actual will, the one drafted by Warren Coates 2 years earlier, the one that irrevocably separated the Gilded Whisk from the rest of our joint estate, specifically to prevent exactly this kind of claim, was sitting in a fireproof safe in Warren's office downtown. And I was its only living beneficiary of record, with no provision whatsoever for a paternity claim. Because Richard, dying and sedated and betrayed by his sister-in-law in a hospice hallway, had made absolutely certain there was no ambiguity left for anyone to exploit. That's when I set down my fork, wiped my mouth with the paper napkin, and said, "Ah, all right." I felt the chuckle rising before I could stop it. Not out of amusement exactly, more out of a kind of disbelieving relief. Because I had spent 11 weeks bracing for something, and here it finally was. Out in the open, in front of 41 witnesses, instead of festering privately where I'd have no way to fight it. Vanessa's face flickered, just slightly, at my calm, because I think some part of her had expected tears or rage or a scene she could later characterize as me attacking her at her son's birthday party, a phrase I later learned from Brianna that Vanessa had also rehearsed as a contingency. I did not give her that scene. I said, in a voice pitched to carry exactly as far as hers had, "Vanessa, I'm going to need you to be very careful about what you say next. Because everything you just said is not just false, it's provably false. And I think, before you say another word, you should ask yourself whether you actually want everyone in this room to hear the proof." My mother made a small, distressed sound. Gary stared very hard at his taco bar plate. Brianna's phone was already out, filming, because of course it was. "Prove it then," Vanessa said, and there was a brittleness under the challenge that told me some part of her already suspected what was coming. I did not, that day, produce the proof. I want to be honest about that, because a satisfying story would have me pulling out Dolores's notarized statement right there at the dessert table and watching my sister crumble in real time in front of 41 witnesses. And that is not what happened. Because I did not yet have the notarized statement in hand. Dolores and I had agreed to have it formally sworn the following week. And because some instinct in me, honed over 14 years of watching Vanessa turn every confrontation into a story about how I was the aggressor, told me that the right room for this reveal was not a backyard birthday party with a rented bounce house. It needed to happen somewhere bigger, somewhere public, somewhere Vanessa herself had no ability to control the exits or manage the narrative afterward with a well-timed tantrum. I said simply, "I'm not doing this here, in front of your son's cake. But I promise you, Vanessa, you will get your proof, and you will get it somewhere you can't spin it." I picked up my purse, I thanked my mother for the party, I left. What I did not know, walking to my car in the fading July light with my hands shaking in a way I hadn't let show inside, was that Brianna's video of the entire exchange, Vanessa's declaration, my 2 sentences of calm refusal, the sound of 41 guests gasping in unison, was already uploading to a group chat of 11 family members and close friends, a group chat Brianna had started years earlier called Fam Updates, and that by midnight it would have been forwarded, screenshotted, and reshared enough times that a version of it would reach, within 4 days, a woman named Renata Alvarez, who ran the regional food blog that had covered the Gilded Whisk's opening a decade earlier, and who would, entirely on her own initiative, reach out to me directly asking if I wanted to comment on the video going around. I did not respond to Renata that week. What I did instead was spend 4 days finishing the work Dolores and I had started, because I had learned, over 14 years of watching my sister operate, that a half-finished counterattack is worse than no counterattack at all. and I was not going to hand Vanessa an opening to claim I'd fabricated something under pressure. Dolores and I met Warren Coates at his office that Wednesday. Dolores gave a formal statement, notarized on the spot by Warren's assistant, describing in precise, dated detail what she'd overheard through that hospice door 3 weeks before Richard died, and what she'd overheard again a week later in the family lounge. She handed over the original supply inventory sheet with her contemporaneous handwriting in the margins, which Warren photographed and placed, along with the notarized statement, into a folder that would eventually sit on a table in front of 41 witnesses at an event Vanessa herself had insisted on attending. Warren also pulled, at my request, the full estate documentation, Richard's will, executed 2 years before his death, explicitly and irrevocably assigning the Gilded Whisk and all associated business assets to me alone, with a clause. Warren had insisted on this clause specifically, over my objections that it felt paranoid at the time, stating that no claim of paternity or dependency arising after the date of execution would have any bearing whatsoever on the disposition of business assets, a clause Warren had included. He told me candidly that day, because in my 30 years doing this work, Diane, I've seen exactly this kind of thing happen to exactly this kind of woman, often enough that I wasn't going to let it happen to you. The medical piece took a little longer, because hospitals do not release records quickly even to the person whose records they are. But by the following Monday, with Richard's prior written authorization on file from years earlier, he had, with characteristic thoroughness, listed me as fully authorized to access his complete medical history in the event of his death. Another quiet piece of protection he'd built for me without my fully understanding, at the time, what it might one day be protecting me from. I had in hand a certified copy of his vasectomy procedure record from 6 years earlier, dated, signed, unambiguous, along with a follow-up semen analysis confirming the procedure's success 8 weeks later, a document neither Vanessa nor anyone else in my family had any reason to know existed, because Richard and I had never discussed the details of Caleb's death or its aftermath with anyone outside our own marriage. I want to explain, honestly, why I didn't simply send this proof directly and privately to Vanessa, end the whole thing quietly, spare everyone the spectacle. I considered it. I sat with the folder on my kitchen table for 2 full evenings, running through what a private resolution would look like, and I kept arriving at the same conclusion. Vanessa had spent 14 years building her credibility inside my family in public, at ribbon cuttings and birthday toasts and hospital bedsides staged for photographs, and a private correction would only ever produce a private admission I had no way to enforce. She would tell my mother, quietly, that we'd worked it out, that it had just been a misunderstanding, and within a year the framed newspaper clipping would still be hanging in her hallway, and some diluted version of the paternity claim would still be circulating at Thanksgiving as an open question nobody quite wanted to litigate. I had watched her rehabilitate smaller lies for a decade. I was not going to give her the raw material to rehabilitate this one. So instead, I did the one thing that felt, to me, both proportionate and inevitable. I let the video Brianna had already leaked keep circulating, and I did not correct it, and I did not deny it, and I let the ambiguity of my 2 sentences at the birthday party, "You will get your proof, and you will get it somewhere you can't spin it," sit in that group chat and in Renata Alvarez's inbox and in the increasingly anxious texts my mother started sending me, asking whether everything I'd said was true, whether I had proof of what, exactly, was I planning to do. The video reached, over that week, roughly 400 people by my later rough accounting. Family friends, a handful of Gilded Whisk regulars who happened to be in Brianna's contacts, and eventually, inevitably, a produce vendor named Fareed Nasser who supplied 3 of our restaurant clients and who mentioned, entirely without malice, at a delivery one Tuesday morning, that there's some video going around about your family, is everything okay? I said everything was fine. I meant it. In a way that surprised me. For the first time in 14 years, I was not managing my family's narrative on the back foot. I was, quietly, deliberately, letting the story reach exactly as far as it needed to reach before I answered it in full, in the one room where nobody could spin it, because I had already chosen that room, and I had already sent, that same week, an invitation. The Gilded Whisk's 10th anniversary gala had been on the calendar for 4 months before any of this happened. Planned originally as a straightforward celebration, 180 guests, press, longtime clients, vendors, a handful of city officials who'd supported our expansion, and, per an invitation list I had honestly forgotten to update after Richard's death, my entire extended family, Vanessa included. because the gala had been planned back when I still believed, foolishly, that grief might soften whatever was coming rather than accelerate it. I did not remove her from the guest list. I want to be completely honest about why. Some part of me, the part that had watched her stage a hospital photograph 11 months in advance, understood that Vanessa would not be able to resist attending an event with press coverage, city officials, and 180 witnesses, an event that represented, in her mind, exactly the kind of public stage where she might finally cement her claim on the business she'd spent a decade insisting was partly hers. I was right. 3 days after the birthday party video started circulating, Vanessa texted me, unprompted, a single message. "I'll be at the gala. I think it's time we settle this like adults, in front of everyone who matters, so there's no more confusion." I read that message 4 times. I did not respond with words. I responded by finalizing, with Warren's office, exactly how and when the folder on my kitchen table would make its appearance. And I began, for the first time in this entire ordeal, to feel something other than grief or dread when I thought about the weeks ahead. I felt something closer to readiness. The 3 weeks between Vanessa's text and the night of the gala were the strangest of my life. Stranger in some ways than the funeral itself, because grief, at least, has a shape everyone recognizes. What I was living through had no shape anyone in my family had a script for, and I watched each of them handle that lack of a script according to exactly the trait that had defined them for a decade. My mother called me 4 times in those 3 weeks, and each call followed the same pattern. She would open by asking, gently, whether there was any way to handle this privately, quietly, so nobody gets hurt, a request that I came, eventually, to understand as Patricia's lifelong flattery instinct curdling into something closer to complicity, because nobody gets hurt had never, in her calculus, included me getting hurt for 14 years, while Vanessa's version of our history hardened into fact. On the 4th call, I finally said, as gently as I could manage, "Mom, I love you, but I need you to understand that I am not the one who chose to do this in public. Vanessa chose a birthday party with 41 witnesses. I'm simply choosing the room where the truth gets to catch up to her lie." My mother was quiet for a long moment, and then she said something that told me, more than anything else in those 3 weeks, how thoroughly Vanessa's 14 years of narrative building had worked on her. "I just don't want to lose either of you. Not, I don't want either of you to have done this. Not, I believe you." Just a wish for peace, offered with total sincerity, from a woman who had spent a decade mistaking peace for the absence of consequences. Gary called me exactly once, 4 days before the gala, from what sounded like his car, parked somewhere with the engine off. He didn't ask me to reconsider anything. He said, haltingly, "I know things you probably don't think I know. I've known for a long time some of what Vanessa says isn't exactly how things happened. I should have said something a long time ago and I didn't, because it was easier not to, and I'm not going to pretend that's not on me." I asked him, directly, whether he'd be willing to say any of that publicly, at the gala, if it came to that. There was a long silence, long enough that I genuinely thought the call had dropped. "I don't know," he finally said. "I want to say yes. I'm telling you honestly, Diane. I don't know if I'm going to be able to." I told him I appreciated the honesty more than he probably realized, and I meant it, because after a decade of watching him say nothing, an honest admission of his own cowardice felt, strangely, like the first real thing Gary had ever offered me. Brianna, predictably, could not stop talking about it, though her allegiance shifted almost hourly depending on who she'd spoken to most recently. She texted me twice asking, with what I think was genuine if shallow curiosity, "Is it true though? Like actually true?" A question I did not dignify with an answer, because I had already decided the gala, and only the gala, would get my answer. She also, I later learned, told at least 6 different people 6 subtly different versions of what she expected to happen, ranging from, "Diane's going to have Vanessa arrested," to, "I heard Diane might actually apologize because she overreacted," a spread so wide it told you everything about how little Brianna actually knew and how much she needed, regardless, to be the one narrating it. I spent those 3 weeks, in the hours I wasn't managing Warren's preparations, doing something I hadn't done in longer than I could remember. I went back into the kitchen myself, actually myself, not overseeing, not managing, and I baked. I made the gala's signature dessert by hand, a burnt honey and lavender tart that had been on the Gilded Whisks menu since the very first year, the recipe Vanessa had once claimed, at a Thanksgiving dinner, to have helped originate. I made it 3 times before I was satisfied, staying at the commercial kitchen until 2, 3 in the morning, the way I had for 14 years, and there was something almost meditative in it, some old, steady part of myself I hadn't fully accessed since Richard's diagnosis. The part of me that had always known exactly who I was, regardless of what anyone else, family included, decided to say about it in a room I wasn't standing in. Dolores came by twice during those 3 weeks, once simply to check on me, and once, 4 days before the gala, to hand me a small manila envelope containing a second, more formal affidavit her attorney friend had helped her draft, one that explicitly stated her willingness to testify to the same facts under oath if the matter ever proceeded to any legal forum. A document Warren told me was, strictly speaking, more than we needed for a purely social confrontation, but which he encouraged me to have anyway. Because Vanessa doesn't strike me as a woman who backs down just because she's embarrassed in a room. Sometimes people like that escalate. You want to be ready for escalation, not just exposure. He was right to worry about that, though none of us that week could have predicted exactly how Vanessa would try to escalate once she understood, in the final days before the gala, that I was not bluffing. 2 days before the event, my mother called again, this time in tears, to tell me Vanessa had retained a lawyer. A man named Corbin Sizemore, whose entire practice, according to the 2-minute internet search I ran the moment I hung up, appeared to consist of aggressive, low-cost cease-and-desist letters aimed at intimidating people who couldn't afford to fight back. I received Sizemore's letter by email the following morning, 4 hours before the gala's guest arrival time. A document that accused me, in language so overwrought it read almost like satire, of orchestrating a campaign of public humiliation against a grieving mother, and demanded I refrain from any public statement regarding the paternity of the minor child MC, pending further legal review. I forwarded it to Warren without comment. Warren called me back within 20 minutes, and I could hear, for the first time in this entire ordeal, something like real anger in his usually measured voice. "Diane," he said, "this letter has no legal weight whatsoever. And frankly, sending it 4 hours before a public event where the truth is about to come out tells me your sister's lawyer is either incompetent or desperate, possibly both. You are not required to refrain from anything. You own the facts. Say them." I want to describe the gala venue for you, because the setting mattered more than I expected it to once the night actually arrived. The Gilded Whisk's flagship events hall occupied the ground floor of a converted textile mill downtown, exposed brick, 22-foot ceilings, the original 1920s steel trusses left visible, and hung with the same warm string lighting we used for every wedding we'd ever catered there. Because I had learned, over a decade, that people trust a room that feels lived in. And I wanted, that night especially, every single person walking through those doors to feel like they were standing somewhere real. Somewhere that had been built, patiently, brick by actual brick, rather than staged for a single evening's performance. 180 guests arrived over the course of that Saturday evening. Longtime clients whose weddings and retirement parties we'd catered for a decade, 3 city council members who'd supported our second location's zoning approval, Renata Alvarez from the food blog, arriving with a photographer and a barely concealed sense that she suspected something newsworthy might happen, a dozen of our 38 employees who'd asked to attend off the clock because, several of them told me warmly at the door, they'd wanted to see the place they'd helped build finally get its full moment. And at 6:52 that evening, 8 minutes before the scheduled toast, Vanessa arrived, with Gary a half step behind her, and Mason, now walking unsteadily, dressed in a small blazer that looked, I noted with the same automatic professional eye I applied to everything, faintly costume-like, as though he'd been dressed less for comfort than for a photograph. I watched them from across the room, near the dessert table where the burnt honey lavender tart sat cooling under glass, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not dread, not the old exhausted irritation, but something closer to calm. I had spent 3 weeks preparing. Warren stood near the small raised platform we used for toasts, a slim leather folder tucked under one arm. Dolores, whom I'd invited personally, sat at a table near the front with a manila envelope resting on her lap. Having told me quietly at the door, "I've been ready to say this out loud for 11 weeks, Diane. I'm not nervous, I'm relieved." The toast was scheduled for 7 o'clock, and I had planned, originally, months earlier, before any of this happened, to simply thank our staff, our clients, the city, and close with a short, warm reflection on 10 years of building something from a $600 box truck. I still opened that way, standing on the small platform with a microphone, 180 faces turned toward me, because I wanted the room to remember, first, what this business actually was before anyone tried to claim a piece of it. I talked briefly about the truck, about the first wedding cake I made for a stranger who couldn't pay full price and got a discount because I liked her laugh, about Richard, about the way he used to time my dough proofing on his phone because I refused to buy a kitchen timer, and the room laughed, warmly, the way rooms do when a story is true and specific and a little bit funny even inside grief. I said his name and felt it catch, a little in my throat, the way it still does, the way I suspect it always will. And then I said, because I had decided, finally, exactly how I wanted to do this. I want to tell you one more thing tonight, because some of you have already heard a version of it, and I don't want anyone in this room going home with the wrong version. I saw Vanessa's spine straighten, 11 feet away, near the dessert table, Mason on her hip in the same practiced angle she'd used at the birthday party and, 11 months before that, in a hospice room. 9 days after I buried my husband, I continued, my sister stood up at her son's birthday party and told 41 people that Mason was Richard's biological child and demanded 50% of an estate built, every recipe and every contract of it, by my own 2 hands over 14 years. She held up a document she called Richard's will. I'd like to introduce you to someone who actually holds that document, because it is not the one my sister was waving around. Warren stepped forward. He did not raise his voice, which somehow made it land harder than if he had. He explained in plain, careful language that Richard Hartwell's actual will, executed 2 years prior to his death, irrevocably assigned the Gilded Whisk and its associated business assets to me alone, with an explicit clause precluding any claim, paternity-based or otherwise, arising after the will's execution. And he held the document up, not dramatically, just clearly, long enough for 180 people to see that it existed, that it was real, that it bore Richard's actual signature and a notary's actual seal, nothing like the folded prop Vanessa had waved at a backyard birthday party. I watched my sister's face across the room, watched the exact moment the confident set of her jaw began, almost imperceptibly, to falter, and I felt the old callback line rise in my throat, the one she'd said to me at my 35th birthday all those years ago, dressed up as a joke, the one that had actually been a seed. To my sister, who I basically dragged into all this in the first place. I said, into the microphone, looking directly at her the way she had looked directly at me across 41 guests. You once told a room full of people you dragged me into baking, that I needed something to do with all my nervous energy. I want you to know, Vanessa, that I've thought about that sentence a lot over the years. And I think you were half right. I did need somewhere to put everything I had. I just built an $8 million company with it, while you spent that same decade building a story instead of a single real thing of your own. Tonight, that story runs out of road. Then Dolores stood up. Dolores walked to the platform with the manila envelope held in both hands, and even though she was not a woman built for public speaking, her voice, when she raised it, carried the same low, unhurried steadiness that had carried Richard through his final 11 weeks. She introduced herself simply, Dolores Reyes, Richard Hartwell's hospice nurse for the final 11 weeks of his life. She told the room, in plain, dated, specific language, that 3 weeks before Richard's death, she had overheard, through a door left partially open, Vanessa Cole asking Richard to allow an unspoken claim of paternity to stand for Mason's sake. For financial reasons, Vanessa had stated explicitly, and that she had heard Richard refuse, twice, the second refusal accompanied by the words, Diane will know, she'll always know, don't do this to her too. She read from the original supply inventory sheet, its margins crammed with handwriting she'd made that same afternoon, 11 months before this night, because some instinct in her had told her, even then, that the truth might need a witness who'd written it down before anyone had a reason to doubt it. The room had gone entirely silent by the time she finished, the particular, total silence of 180 people simultaneously recalculating everything they thought they knew. I watched Renata Alvarez's photographer quietly lower his camera, not out of discretion exactly, more out of the instinctive stillness people fall into around something that has stopped being entertainment and become simply, devastatingly true. Warren stepped forward a second time, and this part I had debated including at all, right up until the final week, because it touched something private, something that belonged, technically, only to Richard and me. I had decided, in the end, that Richard himself had wanted this protected, had built the legal scaffolding for exactly this moment, and that letting his final, careful act of protection go unused now, out of some misplaced sense of delicacy, would be its own kind of betrayal. Warren held up a second document, a certified copy of a medical record, and explained, without unnecessary detail, that Richard Hartwell had undergone a surgical procedure 6 years earlier, rendering biological paternity medically impossible. A procedure confirmed successful by follow-up testing 8 weeks later, both documents obtained with Richard's own prior written authorization, naming me as the party entitled to access them after his death. I did not explain, that night, in front of 180 people, why Richard had made that choice. That part of the story belonged to Caleb, and to the 6 days we had with him, and to nobody in that room who hadn't earned the right to hear it. And I want to say clearly here, to you, watching this now, that I have told you that part only because it explains something Vanessa's claim could never have survived contact with, regardless of anything else that happened that night. The math of it was simply, medically, permanently impossible, and had been for 6 years before Vanessa ever stood up at a birthday party and said otherwise. Vanessa did not, in that silence, do what I had half expected, half hoped for. She did not crumble quietly, did not apologize, did not simply leave. What she did instead, and I think this tells you more about who she actually was than anything else in this entire story, was turn to the room and say, her voice rising, cracking at the edges, "You're all seriously going to believe a nurse we barely know over family? Over me? I have been loyal to this family my entire life, and this is what I get, a public execution at a party from my own sister?" She looked, for a moment, genuinely wounded, and I understood, watching her, that some part of her had actually believed her own performance thoroughly enough to be shocked that the room wasn't performing along with her anymore. It was Gary who spoke next, and I want to be honest that I did not expect it. Not after our phone call 4 days earlier, not after a decade of watching him say nothing at exactly the moments it would have cost him something small to say anything at all. He stood up from his table, Mason now fussing quietly in his arms, having been passed to him at some point in the last several minutes, and he said, in a voice that shook but did not stop, "Vanessa, I heard you say it too. In the car, 3 weeks before the funeral. You told me you were going to say the boy was Richard's if it came to it, and I told you not to, and you did it anyway, and I have spent every day since then hating myself for not saying something the second I heard Diane got that phone call from the nurse. I'm not doing that again tonight. I'm done being quiet so things stay comfortable." The room made a sound, low, collective, the sound of 180 people watching a decade of accumulated silence finally break. My mother did not speak, not that night, and I want to tell you honestly that her silence hurt more than almost anything else that happened, because some small, stubborn part of me had hoped, even then, that she would finally, publicly, choose truth over temperature. She did not. She sat very still at her table, her hand pressed against her mouth, and I understood, watching her, that Patricia Whitfield's 14 years of flattering whoever was in the room had left her, in the one moment that actually mattered, without any practiced instinct for simply telling the truth out loud. I did not resent her for it that night. I felt mostly a tired, old grief for the mother I'd always half hoped she might eventually become, and a quiet acceptance that she probably never would. Brianna, for her part, had her phone raised the entire time, filming, and I learned later that the video she captured that night, Dolores's testimony, Warren's documents, Gary's confession, Vanessa's unraveling, reached within 4 days more than 60,000 views across the same platforms where the birthday party clip had first spread, a fact I feel almost nothing about except a kind of weary irony. The same instinct in my cousin that had spread my sister's lie for a decade ended up, in the end, being the exact mechanism that preserved the truth in a form nobody could later dispute or reframe. Vanessa left the gala roughly 9 minutes after Dolores finished speaking. Mason handed back to her from Gary's arms, Gary himself staying behind, standing near the platform afterward with an expression I can only describe as a man setting down a weight he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten it was optional. Sizemore, her lawyer, sent no further letters. Warren told me, 3 weeks later, that Sizemore had quietly declined to continue representing her once he'd reviewed the documentation Warren forwarded, a fact that told me even a lawyer willing to write an aggressive, overreaching cease-and-desist letter had his limits when the underlying claim turned out to be not just weak but medically, provably impossible. I stood on that small platform afterward, in a room slowly filling back up with the low murmur of 180 people processing what they'd just watched, and Renata Alvarez approached me, notebook in hand, and asked, gently, if I wanted to say anything on the record. I told her, the only thing I want on the record is that this business was built by one person, with a husband who supported that person completely, and no one else. Everything else people want to say about tonight, they can say for themselves. She wrote it down. It ran, 4 days later, not as a scandal piece but as a profile. about a widow who'd built an $8 million company from a $600 truck and refused, even under a public paternity claim, to let anyone rewrite that story for her. I want to tell you what happened to each of them, individually, over the year that followed, because I think the specifics matter more than a general sense that everything worked out, and because I promised myself, standing in that events hall the night of the gala, that I would eventually tell this whole story without softening any of the endings, just to make the people involved feel less exposed than they'd chosen to be. Vanessa and Gary's house went into foreclosure 5 months after the gala. The second mortgage, the one taken out 9 months before Richard's diagnosis, finally caught up with the pending notice of default I'd found in county records during those first quiet weeks of investigation, and by the following spring, Vanessa was renting a 2-bedroom apartment across town, a fact I know only because my mother mentioned it, unprompted, in a tone that seemed to want my sympathy, and I found, sitting with that information, that I felt something closer to a flat, unsentimental acknowledgement than either satisfaction or grief. The wellness coaching certification business never reopened. The last I heard, secondhand, filtered through my mother, was that Vanessa had taken a position managing a small retail store at a strip mall an hour outside the city, a job I'm sure she performs perfectly adequately and derives no particular pride from mentioning at family gatherings, which, notably, she no longer attends with any consistency, because the family gatherings themselves have changed shape since that night. Smaller, quieter, built around fewer performed narratives and more actual honesty than they'd managed to hold in over a decade. Gary and Vanessa separated 7 months after the gala, not, from what I understand, primarily because of the paternity claim itself, but because Gary's one moment of public honesty that night seemed to have cracked something open in him that he couldn't fully close back up afterward. He called me once, roughly 8 months out, mostly to apologize, in a halting, unpracticed way, for a decade of silence he said he finally understood the cost of. I told him I appreciated it, and I meant it, though I also told him honestly that an apology 8 months after the fact, however sincere, doesn't erase a decade of choosing comfort over truth, and he said, quietly, that he understood that too, and that he wasn't calling to be forgiven, just to say it out loud to the one person he felt he owed it to most. He has partial custody of Mason now, and I've heard, again through my mother, that he's become, unexpectedly, a genuinely careful and present father, the kind of steady presence he apparently couldn't manage to be for his marriage, but has found, somehow, for his son, which I think is its own complicated human kind of redemption, one I don't need to fully forgive to acknowledge as real. Mason, for what it's worth, remains entirely innocent in all of this, a fact I want to state plainly because I think it's easy, in a story like this, to let a child become collateral damage in the retelling, a symbol instead of a person. He is a small boy who did not choose his mother's desperation, and I have made my own quiet peace with the fact that I will likely have some limited, careful relationship with him as he grows, as my actual nephew, regardless of the false claim briefly attached to his name at a birthday party he will never remember and, I sincerely hope, never need to know the full details of until he's old enough to understand it as his mother's failure and not his own inheritance of shame. My mother's transformation, if you can call it that, has been slower and less complete, which feels true to who she's always been. She has not fully reckoned, in the year since the gala, with the 14 years she spent flattering whichever daughter's narrative was currently in the room, and I don't know that she ever fully will, because that kind of reckoning would require her to sit with a version of herself as someone who enabled real harm rather than simply, gently, kept the peace. What has changed, concretely, is smaller but not nothing. She no longer repeats Vanessa's old stories about the business, because there's no one left actively feeding her new ones to repeat, and she has, twice in the past year, actually asked me questions about the actual, factual history of the Gilded Whisk. Questions with the tentative, slightly embarrassed quality of someone realizing, late, how much of what she thought she knew about her own daughter's life had been secondhand and unverified for over a decade. I don't know if that counts as growth. I've decided, for my own peace, to treat it as a start. Brianna's fixed trait, predictably, adapted to the new information rather than being challenged by it. Within a month of the gala, she was telling anyone who'd listen that she had always had a bad feeling about Vanessa. Honestly, something always felt off. A claim that conveniently erased a decade of her own enthusiastic participation in spreading Vanessa's fabrications. I find this, if I'm honest, almost more instructive than anything else that happened in this whole story, because it's a reminder that some people don't learn from exposure, they simply update their own personal narrative to have always been on the winning side, and Brianna has continued, in the year since, to to be exactly who she always was. Not malicious exactly, just perpetually, unreflectively certain that whatever she's currently saying is the version that was true all along. And me. I want to end this part of the story with what actually changed in my own life, because I think that matters more than an accounting of everyone else's consequences. The Gilded Whisk had its best year on record in the 12 months following the gala, not because of any of this drama directly, but because Renata Alvarez's profile and the quiet, cascading word of mouth that followed it brought in a wave of new corporate catering clients who'd apparently been meaning to book with us for years and finally did, once the business had a face and a story attached to it that felt, for the first time in a public way, entirely unambiguously mine. I opened a third location this past spring, in a building I chose myself, with a kitchen I designed myself, and on the wall of the entryway, instead of a framed newspaper clipping with someone else's name misattributed beneath my photograph, I hung a single photograph of the original box truck, rust and all, $600, parked in a strip mall parking lot 14 years ago, because I wanted every person who walked through that door to see, plainly, where this actually started and who actually built it. I think about Richard often, more often than I let most people see, and I think in particular about that afternoon in Warren's office when he insisted on a clause I thought was needlessly paranoid at the time, the one that severed the business entirely from any claim that might arise after his death. I understand now that he wasn't being paranoid. He was doing the last quiet thing a dying man could do to protect the person he loved from a betrayal he could sense coming, even before he had proof of it. And I think, if I've learned anything from all of this, it's that the people who truly see you don't just admire what you've built. They anticipate the ways it might be taken from you, and they build their own quiet defenses into the architecture long before you ever need them. If there's a lesson in any of this, and I've turned it over enough times now that I think I finally trust my own answer, it's this. The people who spend years quietly documenting, quietly protecting, quietly refusing to perform for a room, are very often mistaken. For a long time, for the less interesting sibling, the less dramatic story, the one who just likes to keep her head down. I'd ask you this, if you've made it this far. How many people in your own life have you underestimated simply because they never needed an audience to know what they were worth? I want to go back, before I close this out completely, to the truck, because I don't think you can understand what it meant to hear Vanessa claim a piece of this business unless you understand what building it actually felt like from the inside, in the years nobody was watching closely enough to lie about later. The truck smelled, for the first 6 months I owned it, like the ghost of every fast food operation that had used it before me, a stale, greasy undertone I scrubbed at obsessively with baking soda and vinegar until my hands cracked in the Ohio winter air. I gutted the interior myself, with a borrowed drill and a set of tutorials I watched on a cracked phone screen propped against a mixing bowl, because I could not afford to hire anyone, and Richard, who was still just a man who'd bought too many hand pies at that point, not yet my husband, showed up unannounced one Saturday with a case of bottled water and a folding chair, and sat outside the truck for 6 hours while I worked. Not offering advice, just being present, which I understand now was its own kind of courtship, quieter and more useful than flowers. I ran that truck for 2 years before the first storefront, parked outside a hardware store, outside a farmer's market, outside 3 different office parks on a rotating weekly schedule I kept on an index card, taped to the dashboard. I remember specific mornings with a clarity that surprises me, the particular cold of a March morning at 4 a.m., proofing dough in a bowl wrapped in towels and set on the truck's dashboard because the ambient temperature inside was the only warm spot I had access to before the generator kicked the oven on. I remember the exact weight of the first real order I ever got for 100 dozen mini quiches, for a corporate breakfast meeting, an order so large relative to my equipment that I had to run 3 separate baking shifts through the night to fill it, falling asleep sitting upright against the truck's back wheel at 5 in the morning, with flowers still under my fingernails, waking to Richard's knock on the truck door with 2 coffees, because he had, without me asking, started showing up at 4:30 most mornings that week just to make sure I wasn't doing all of it entirely alone. Nobody in my family ever asked me about those mornings. Not once in 14 years did my mother or Vanessa ask what it had actually felt like to build the truck's menu from nothing, to lose an entire batch of $200 worth of ingredients to a broken thermostat, and cry in a gas station parking lot at midnight because $200 was, that month, the difference between making rent and not. What they asked about, when they asked about anything at all, was whether the business was profitable yet, whether I'd be able to help out at Vanessa's next venture once things picked up, whether I'd consider a booth at whatever community event Vanessa was currently trying to break into. The labor itself, the actual 4 a.m. hours, the actual cracked hands and burnt forearms, and the specific, hard-won knowledge of exactly how long a croissant dough needs to rest, at exactly what temperature to laminate properly in humid Ohio summers, none of that ever seemed to interest anyone enough to ask about, which is precisely, I think now, why it was so easy for Vanessa to later claim a piece of it. She had never once been curious enough about the actual mechanics of my life to know what she was lying about, and neither had anyone who believed her. There's a specific memory I return to more than almost any other from those years, and I want to give it to you because I think it explains something about who I became and why I was capable, eventually, of standing calmly in front of 41 people and saying, "Ah, all right," instead of falling apart. It was a Tuesday in late October, the truck's second autumn, and I had a booking fall through at the last minute, a corporate lunch for 60 that canceled 2 hours before pickup, leaving me with 60 boxed lunches, paid ingredients, and no buyer. I drove the truck, on instinct, to a homeless shelter downtown I'd read about in the local paper, and I gave the entire order away. 60 lunches, no charge, no announcement, no photograph. The shelter director tried to write me a receipt for tax purposes, and I told her not to bother. I drove home that night with an empty truck and a bank account that could not, strictly speaking, afford the gesture I'd just made, and I felt, for reasons I couldn't fully articulate at the time, more like myself than I had in months. I think what I learned that night, quietly, privately, unwitnessed, was that the actual value of what I was building had never depended on who got credit for it. That lesson sat dormant in me for over a decade. It's the exact lesson that let me watch Vanessa's newspaper clipping hang in her hallway for 6 years without losing my mind over it, because some old, settled part of me had already decided, back in that shelter parking lot, that the work itself was the point, and the credit, when it eventually mattered, would take care of itself. It did eventually take care of itself, but not without a cost I want to be honest about, because I don't want to leave you with the impression that watching my sister's lies accumulate for a decade cost me nothing internally just because I handled it outwardly with calm. There were years, particularly the 2 years after the newspaper clipping incident, when I genuinely considered stepping back from family gatherings altogether. When I sat in my car outside my mother's house more than once, engine running, working up the nerve to go inside and sit through another dinner, where Vanessa's fabricated version of our shared history would be treated as established fact by everyone at the table. I want to name that cost plainly. It is exhausting, in a way that doesn't show up on any balance sheet, to be the reliable one, the one who doesn't need anything, the one whose actual labor gets treated as ambient weather instead of achievement, while someone else's performed labor gets celebrated as generosity. I don't think I fully processed how much that exhaustion had accumulated until the night of the gala, when I finally, publicly, got to set it down. I've told you already about the day Richard proposed, in the loosest sense, but I never told you the actual proposal, and I think it belongs here, because it explains the marriage that Vanessa spent years trying to rewrite the meaning of. It happened 11 months after the farmer's market on a Tuesday, not a weekend, because Richard told me later he didn't want the memory competing with anyone else's idea of what a proposal was supposed to look like. He drove me to the empty lot where the truck usually parked on Tuesdays, after hours, when the market had closed and the asphalt was still warm from the day's sun, and he'd set up a single folding table with a tablecloth he'd clearly bought that afternoon, still creased from the packaging, and he'd ordered, from a restaurant 3 towns over, the exact meal I'd once mentioned offhandedly, months earlier, as the first real meal my grandmother Loretta ever cooked for me after my parents' divorce, a detail I hadn't expected him to remember, let alone track down a version of. He didn't kneel. He just took my hand across the folding table and said, "I don't want to build a life around your business succeeding or not succeeding. I want to build a life around the fact that you get up at 4 in the morning for something you believe in, and I think that's the rarest thing I've ever seen in a person, and I'd like to spend the rest of my life getting to watch you do it." I said yes before he'd technically finished asking, which became a running joke between us for the next 13 years, the year I answered a question before he'd asked the actual words. I bring this up not just for its own sake, but because it stands in such total, stark contrast to the version of my marriage Vanessa eventually tried to construct. The version where Richard was some passive, biddable figure she could retroactively claim had wanted to make things right by naming a child that wasn't his. The man who proposed to me on a folding table with a creased tablecloth, who remembered a single sentence I'd said once about my grandmother's cooking, who spent 13 years timing my dough proofing on his phone because I refused to buy a real timer, was not a man capable of quietly assenting to a lie about his own dying wishes. Vanessa's claim wasn't just legally impossible, it was a fundamental misreading of who Richard actually was, built by someone who had never once, in all those years, bothered to actually know him beyond what he could offer her. There's a scene I haven't told you about yet, from about 8 years into our marriage, 3 years before Caleb, that I think belongs here because it shows Vanessa's pattern operating on Richard directly, not just on the family's perception of me. Richard's firm had just closed a significant deal, a mixed-use development downtown that had taken 2 years of negotiation, and at the celebratory family dinner my mother hosted, Vanessa spent the evening asking him detailed, flattering questions about the deal structure, the financing, the city approvals, questions with a specificity that struck me, even then, as slightly odd for someone who'd never expressed any interest in commercial real estate before. 2 weeks later, Richard mentioned, almost in passing, that Vanessa had called him directly, not me, asking if he'd be willing to mentor her on a real estate investment idea she was developing, something involving a small strip of retail units she wanted to flip. Richard, characteristically kind and characteristically unable to simply say no to a family member without a very good reason, spent 4 Saturday afternoons that spring walking Vanessa through basic real estate financing concepts, reviewing a business plan that, he told me later, had no realistic path to profitability given her available capital. He told her so, gently, directly, and Vanessa thanked him warmly and then told my mother, within the week, that Richard had basically agreed to back her real estate venture. A claim so far from what had actually happened that Richard himself, usually the most patient man I knew, called Vanessa directly to correct the record. A call that ended, according to what he told me afterward, with Vanessa accusing him of changing his mind because Diane got jealous. A reframing so audaciously untrue that even Richard, who rarely spoke ill of my family, said afterward, "Your sister doesn't experience being told no, she experiences it as a temporary setback in a story she's already decided is true." I share that memory because I think it's important you understand Vanessa didn't only target me, she targeted whoever held resources she needed, and she recalibrated her approach to each person's specific weaknesses with an intuition that, in a different context, might have been an actual professional skill. With my mother, she deployed the language of loyalty and family duty. With Brianna, she deployed the thrill of being first to know something. With Gary, she deployed simple, patient conflict avoidance, letting his own cowardice do most of the work for her. And with Richard, in that one instance, she deployed flattery specific enough to feel, briefly, like genuine interest before pivoting immediately to extraction the moment he offered anything of value. I think about Caleb often in the context of all of this, more than I've let most people see, and I want to give you one more piece of that week, because I think it's the piece that makes clearest exactly what kind of cruelty Vanessa's claim actually represented, underneath the financial and legal dimensions of it. On the 5th day of Caleb's life, the day before the doctors told us there was nothing more to try, Richard sat beside the incubator for 11 straight hours, one finger resting against Caleb's tiny hand through the access port, and he sang to him, quietly, off-key, a song I didn't recognize until Richard told me later it was something his own mother used to sing to him, a woman who died when Richard was 19, and whom he rarely spoke about. I stood in the doorway of that NICU room and watched my husband commit, in real time, to loving a son he was about to lose completely, with a totality that had nothing hedged or held back in it. And I understood, watching him, exactly the kind of father he would have been, and exactly how much the surgery he requested 4 days later cost him, a closing of a door he'd wanted, desperately, to walk through again. For Vanessa to stand up 11 months after his death and claim that this same man, the one who sang off-key to a dying infant and then closed that door forever, rather than risk that grief again, had somehow fathered a secret child and simply neglected to mention it, was not just a lie about money. It was a violation of the single most sacred, most privately devastating thing Richard and I ever went through together. Deployed casually, at a birthday party, over Prosecco and a grocery store sheet cake, for the sake of $4 million. I want that distinction on the record, because I think it's the part of this story that made the confrontation feel, to me, less like a business dispute and more like something closer to a reckoning that had been owed for a very long time. I want to tell you more about Dolores because in a story built around a family that failed to see who actually mattered, she deserves more than the role of a plot device who happened to be in the right hallway at the right time. Dolores had been a hospice nurse for a decade by the time she met Richard, after 20 years before that in a hospital oncology ward, and she told me once, during one of her visits after the funeral, that she'd left hospital nursing specifically because she'd grown tired of medicine that treated dying as a problem to be managed, rather than an experience to be honored, and hospice work, for all its heaviness, had given her back a sense that her presence in a room actually mattered to the people in it, not just their charts. She had a daughter of her own, grown now, living 2 states away, and a husband, Manuel, who'd passed 6 years earlier from a stroke. Sudden, no warning, no 11 weeks of preparation the way Richard's illness had given the rest of us. She told me once that part of why she'd stayed so attentive in that hospice hallway, part of why she'd written down what she heard on the back of a supply sheet instead of simply letting it pass, was that she'd never gotten the chance to protect Manuel from anything in his final moments. There'd been no final moments to protect, no 11 weeks of small, deliberate acts of care, and something in her had transferred, without her fully realizing it until much later, all of that unspent protective instinct onto Richard, and by extension, onto me. I asked her once, sitting at my kitchen table months after the gala, why she'd been willing to stand up in front of 180 strangers and testify to something so private, something that had nothing, technically, to do with her own life. She thought about it for a long moment before answering. Because Richard asked me for one thing in 11 weeks, she said. Just one. He asked me, near the end, if I'd make sure people didn't get to rewrite what actually happened to him once he couldn't correct it himself. I told him I'd do my best. I didn't know at the time that I'd end up doing it in a room with a microphone in it. But a promise is a promise, Diane, whether you make it in a quiet hospice room or you have to keep it in front of a crowd. I have thought about that answer more times than I can count in the year since. Dolores Reyes owed my family nothing. She had refilled our water pitchers and been treated, by almost everyone but me, as invisible furniture in the background of our tragedy. And she chose, anyway, to keep a promise to a dying man she'd known for 11 weeks, at real personal and professional risk to herself, because she believed the truth was worth more than her own comfort. I've since made her, at her insistence that it not be some kind of guilt thing, a standing member of the Gilded Whisks Community Advisory Board, a small, mostly ceremonial role that comes with a modest stipend and, more importantly to both of us, a standing invitation to every major event we host. Because I decided a long time ago that the people who show up for you in the rooms nobody's watching deserve, eventually, a permanent seat at the ones everybody is. Warren Coates deserves a similar acknowledgement, though his role in my life predates all of this by years. He'd been Richard's family attorney since before I met Richard, a careful, understated man in his early 60s who wore the same 3 gray suits in rotation and had, over 3 decades of practice, developed what I can only describe as an occupational instinct for the specific ways families destroy each other over money and grief simultaneously. He told me, the week after the gala, over coffee in his office, that he'd seen some version of Vanessa's move probably a dozen times across his career. Families where a sibling's resentment, left unaddressed for long enough, eventually curdled into exactly this kind of desperate public grab, and that the single biggest factor in whether the targeted party survived it intact was almost never the strength of the underlying legal claim, which was usually weak, but rather whether the targeted party had, like Richard, done the unglamorous, unromantic work of documentation years in advance, when it felt paranoid and unnecessary rather than urgent. The people who get destroyed by this, he told me, are the ones who assumed decency would hold. Richard never assumed that, not because he thought poorly of your sister specifically, but because 30 years of doing this work taught him that hope is not a legal strategy. I want to say something now about the year after the gala that I haven't fully articulated yet, which is what it actually felt like, internally, to stop managing a lie that had been running in the background of my life for over a decade. I started therapy 4 months after the gala, later than I probably should have, with a therapist named Dr. Priya Chandrasekaran who specializes in complicated grief, and one of the first things she asked me, in our second session, was whether I'd ever grieved Caleb fully, separately from grieving Richard, or whether the two griefs had become so tangled together over 6 years that I'd stopped being able to tell where one ended and the other began. I sat with that question longer than I expected to. The honest answer, which took me several more sessions to arrive at, was that I had never fully grieved Caleb at all. Not really, because Richard's vasectomy and the practical, forward-moving momentum of rebuilding our life afterward had given me a kind of permission to file that grief away, as settled, handled, closed the way Richard had wanted the door closed, when in truth it had simply been buried under 14 more years of work and, eventually, under Richard's own longer, slower dying. Vanessa's claim, cruel as it was, ended up forcing open a door I hadn't realized I'd left shut for 6 years. And in the strangest, most unwelcome way, the process of assembling proof against her lie became also, unavoidably, a process of finally sitting with the truth of what we'd actually lost. I cried, properly, for the first time in longer than I could remember. Not at the funeral, not at the gala, but on an ordinary Tuesday 4 months later, sitting in Dr. Chandrasekharan's office, holding a photograph of Caleb's hospital bracelet that I'd pulled out of the fireproof lockbox alongside all the business records. And I understood, crying in that quiet office, that some part of the calm I'd shown at the birthday party and the gala had been real, hard-won steadiness, and some part of it had also been the same old, practiced skill I'd developed my entire life. The skill of not needing anyone else to witness what something actually cost me. I am, a year later, still working on unlearning that particular skill, at least selectively, at least with the people who've actually earned the right to see the cost. I want to go back and tell you about 2 more scenes with Patricia and Brianna that I left out earlier, because I think they add texture to exactly how entrenched the family pattern had become by the time Vanessa made her final move. And because I think it's useful to see the pattern operating in smaller, quieter moments, not just the big dramatic ones. The first happened about a year before Richard's diagnosis, at a spring gathering my mother hosted for no particular occasion, just a Sunday dinner she'd decided to make into an event. I had brought a new pastry I was testing for the wholesale line, a brown butter financier with a citrus glaze that had taken me 3 weeks of iteration to get exactly right, and I set the tray down on my mother's counter with a small, uncharacteristic flutter of pride, because I rarely brought unfinished work to family gatherings, preferring to only show people the polished version once it was already on menus. Vanessa picked one up before anyone else had a chance to, took a bite, and said, loudly enough for the kitchen to hear, "Oh, this is really similar to something I was playing around with for my old boutique. Actually, the citrus thing. Funny how that works." There was no old boutique pastry line. There had never been any indication Vanessa had ever attempted to bake anything more complex than the store-bought casserole she'd once tried to pass off as homemade. But my mother, standing at the stove, said, without missing a beat, "You two really do think alike sometimes. It's sweet." And something in me, standing there holding a tray I'd spent 3 weeks perfecting, simply went quiet, because I had learned, by then, that correcting the record in real time cost more social capital than it was worth. And I ate my own financier in silence and did not bring unfinished work to family dinners again for the rest of that year. The second scene happened at Brianna's own bridal shower, 18 months before the gala, an event I attended and, at Brianna's request, catered at cost as a gift. Standing near the gift table, I overheard Brianna telling a cluster of her friends, gesturing toward the dessert spread I'd built for the event. My Aunt Diane and my Aunt Vanessa run this amazing bakery together. It's honestly like a total sister power thing. I love it. I want to note, precisely, how small and casual that lie was, delivered without malice, without even much thought. Simply because sister power thing was a more interesting sentence to say to a cluster of 20-something friends than the more accurate, more boring truth that one aunt built a business alone over 14 years, while the other aunt occasionally showed up to take photographs near it. Nobody in that cluster of friends had any reason to doubt Brianna. The lie cost me nothing that day, materially, and it cost Vanessa nothing to let it stand, and multiplied by a decade of moments exactly like it, at showers and birthdays and casual conversations at nail salons and gym classes I was never present for, it built, brick by invisible brick, the exact kind of ambient, unquestioned credibility Vanessa was counting on the night she stood up at Mason's birthday party and expected the room to simply believe her the way it always had. I bring up these smaller scenes because I think the version of this story that only includes the dramatic confrontations misses something important about how narratives like Vanessa's actually get built. It is never one enormous lie. It is a decade of small, low-stakes, deniable exaggerations, each one individually too petty to fight over, each one collectively constructing a scaffold sturdy enough, eventually, to hold up a $4 million claim in front of 41 witnesses who had spent 10 years being trained, one financier and one bridal shower toast at a time, to believe her first. The third location I opened this past spring deserves more attention than I gave it earlier, because I think it represents, more than anything else, what I actually chose to build with the year that followed the gala, instead of continuing to relitigate what had happened to me. I found the building myself, a former print shop on a block that was, like the hardware store block 14 years earlier, considered by most people a mistake, too far from the main commercial corridor, too much deferred maintenance in the roof. I saw, walking through it with a realtor on a gray Tuesday afternoon, exactly what I'd seen in that first storefront. Good bones under bad paint. A kitchen that could be built out properly if someone was patient enough to do it right instead of fast. I hired, for that location, 4 new pastry cooks straight out of the regional culinary program, all of them women in their early 20s, and I found myself, training them through their first few months, saying things to them I wished someone had said to me at their age. That the work itself was the whole point. That credit, when it came, would come on its own schedule and often from unexpected directions. That the people who doubted them in a family kitchen were not always the people whose opinions should get to define the shape of their ambition. One of them, a 23-year-old named Sofia Delgado, cried in the walk-in cooler during her second week, overwhelmed by a wedding order that had ballooned unexpectedly, and I found her there, sat down on an overturned bucket beside her, and told her about the March morning I'd fallen asleep against the truck's back wheel with flour under my fingernails. And I watched something in her posture change, watching her realize that the woman who now owned 3 locations and employed 40-some people had once, herself, been exactly this overwhelmed, exactly this uncertain whether she was actually capable of what she'd taken on. I think that's part of what Vanessa's decade of small thefts never understood. The story of how something gets built matters, not just to the person who builds it, but to everyone who comes after and needs proof that the unglamorous, unwitnessed hours are actually where the real value gets made. The gala itself, in the years since, has become something I think about with a complicated kind of gratitude I didn't expect to feel. I did not want any of it. I would have traded every ounce of public vindication for one more year of Richard alive, timing my dough proofing on his phone at our kitchen table, and I want that stated plainly, because I don't want anyone watching this to think the ending felt, to me, like a triumph in any simple sense. It felt more like a debt finally settled, a ledger finally balanced, closed in the one currency my family had always understood, which was public perception, and I take no particular joy in having had to fight that battle on those specific terms. But I am, if I'm honest, deeply and permanently grateful that Richard, dying, exhausted, betrayed by a woman he'd spent 13 years quietly tolerating for my sake, still found the strength and the foresight to build me a set of defenses I didn't fully understand I'd need until I needed all of them at once, in a room full of 180 witnesses, 9 months after I'd buried him. Renata Alvarez's profile ran under the headline, "The Woman Who Built It Alone," and I want to tell you about the week after it published, because the response taught me something about my own community I hadn't expected to learn at 43 years old, 9 months after burying my husband. The piece did not sensationalize the paternity claim, did not name Vanessa directly. Out of a professional discretion I appreciated more than Renata probably realized, focusing instead on the 14-year arc of the business itself, the truck, the first storefront, the wholesale expansion, and closing with a single paragraph about a public family dispute recently and decisively resolved in Hartwell's favor. Language vague enough to protect Mason's privacy, while still unmistakably confirming that the video everyone had already seen was exactly what it appeared to be. Within days, clients I hadn't heard from in years started reaching back out, not out of pity, which I'd half braced for and dreaded, but with a kind of renewed specific interest in the actual story of the business, wanting to book anniversary parties and retirement dinners and quinceañeras with, several of them told me directly, the woman who actually built the thing herself. A local high school reached out asking if I'd speak to their business class about entrepreneurship, a request I said yes to somewhat nervously, having never once in 14 years thought of myself as someone with lessons to impart rather than simply someone with dough to proof. I stood in front of 31 17-year-olds on a Thursday afternoon in October and told them, plainly, about the truck, about the $200 I lost to a broken thermostat, about the specific, unglamorous arithmetic of building something real. And a girl in the back row, maybe 16, raised her hand and asked, "Did you ever want to just give up, though, when nobody believed in it but you?" I told her the truth, that giving up had crossed my mind more times than I could count, but that somewhere along the way I'd stopped needing anyone else's belief as a precondition for continuing, and that the version of me who finally stood up to my own family had been built, slowly, out of 10,000 small mornings where nobody was watching and I kept going anyway. I want to tell you, too, about a smaller, quieter consequence of that year that I didn't expect. I started, for the first time in my adult life, building something like real friendships outside my family. Relationships that had nothing to do with managing anyone's perception of me. Sofia Delgado, the young pastry cook who cried in the walk-in cooler, became someone I now have dinner with roughly once a month. Not as her employer exactly, more as something closer to the mentor I never had at her age. Dolores and I have coffee every few weeks, an easy, unhurried habit that grew naturally out of gratitude into something that feels, now, more like genuine friendship than obligation. Even Renata, who I'd initially approached with wariness given her profession, has become someone I trust enough to call when I need an honest, outside read on a decision, precisely because our relationship started with her respecting a boundary I set, rather than chasing a more sensational version of the story she could easily have written instead. I think in the end, what Vanessa's betrayal actually cost her, beyond the house and the marriage and the reputation, was something harder to quantify and, I suspect, harder for her to ever fully recover. She spent 14 years building a story about her own life that depended entirely on my family believing her over verifying anything. And once that dependency was exposed as exactly what it was, she was left without the one skill she'd actually spent a decade honing, which was performance in the absence of substance. I don't know what she's building now in her two-bedroom apartment, managing a strip mall retail store an hour outside the city. I hope, honestly, for Mason's sake if nothing else, that it's something real, something she's actually earning rather than narrating, because I don't wish her the kind of ongoing devastation that would be easy, in a story like this, to want for her. I simply no longer feel obligated to manage the gap between what she says and what's actually true. That management for 14 years was work I did for free, out of a exhausted, inherited sense of family obligation, and I have decided, in the year since the gala, that I am done doing it, for her or for anyone else who mistakes my quiet for a lack of memory. There's one more scene I want to give you before I close this out, because I think it's the truest ending this story actually has, truer than the gala itself, even though it's much smaller and nobody was filming it. It happened this past March on the anniversary of Richard's death, a date I still mark alone, deliberately, without family present, because I've learned that some grief needs a room with no performance requirement attached to it at all. I drove out to the cemetery in the early morning, before the shop opened, with a single lemon financier wrapped in wax paper, the same recipe from that spring dinner years ago, the one Vanessa once claimed as her own idea in my mother's kitchen. I sat on the grass beside his headstone, the dogwood tree from the hospice window somehow echoed by a young maple someone had planted near the cemetery's edge, not yet in full leaf, and I told him, out loud, alone, everything that had happened in the year since. The gala, Dolores's testimony, Gary's apology, my mother's small, imperfect attempts at reckoning, the third location, Sophia in the walk-in cooler, the 17-year-olds in the business class. I told him his estate clause had worked exactly the way he'd built it to work, and that Warren had been right about hope not being a legal strategy, and that I was, finally, slowly, starting to feel like a whole person again instead of a widow managing a lawsuit that never technically became a lawsuit. I ate half the financier myself, sitting there in the cold March grass, and left the other half on the headstone, the way I'd started doing on every visit since the funeral. A small, private ritual that has nothing to do with anyone else's belief or disbelief, nothing to do with proof or documentation or public vindication, just a woman, and the recipe she built, and the man who believed in her before anyone else in her life bothered to ask what it had actually cost her to become who she was. I think that's the real ending. Not the microphone, not the folder of documents, not even Dolores standing up in front of 180 people. Just a quiet Tuesday morning in a cemetery, a pastry that took me 3 weeks to perfect, and the settled, hard-won knowledge that I never, not once, needed my family's belief to know exactly what I had built and exactly who had helped me build it. I haven't told you yet what happened in the hour immediately after the gala ended, once the string lights were dimmed and the catering staff had started clearing tables, because I think that hour, quieter and less public than anything else in this story, actually did more to settle things inside me than the confrontation itself. My mother stayed behind, along with Warren and Dolores, and the four of us sat at a corner table with the last of the burnt honey lavender tart between us, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, my mother asked me a direct, unflattering question about my own history, instead of one designed to smooth over whatever tension was currently in the room. She asked, quietly, "How long have you known Vanessa was capable of something like this?" I told her the truth, that I hadn't known, not with certainty, not until Dolores called me, but that some part of me had been quietly documenting, quietly bracing, for at least 6 years, ever since the newspaper clipping, because some instinct in me had understood, long before I had proof, that a person who lies about a caption will eventually, given enough desperation and enough time, lie about something that actually costs someone. My mother sat with that for a long moment, turning her water glass slowly on the tablecloth, and then she said something I've held on to since, imperfect as it was. I think I taught both of you, without meaning to, that the loudest story in the room gets treated as the truest one. I'm sorry it took losing so much for me to see that clearly. It wasn't a full reckoning. It wasn't an admission that she'd actively enabled 14 years of fabrication. But it was more honesty than she'd offered me in a decade. And I decided, sitting at that corner table with tart crumbs on the tablecloth and my husband 9 months in the ground, that I could accept an imperfect beginning without demanding a complete one, before I let myself feel anything like relief. Warren, for his part, told me something that night I've thought about often since, about the nature of the clause Richard had insisted on 2 years before his death. Most of my clients, he said, want protection against the obvious threats: business partners, competitors, creditors. Richard was one of maybe a handful of clients in 30 years who wanted protection against the people who were supposed to love him best. That's a harder thing to plan for, because it requires admitting, on paper, that love isn't always a reliable predictor of good behavior. He did that admission willingly for you years before he had any concrete reason to suspect it would matter. I asked Warren that night whether he thought Richard had actually suspected something specific about Vanessa, some early instinct he'd never voiced to me directly. Warren considered the question carefully before answering. I think, he said, your husband simply understood, better than most people, that scarcity does strange things to people who've spent their whole lives feeling like they were handed the smaller half of everything. He didn't need to predict exactly what Vanessa would do. He just understood the shape of what someone in her position might eventually be capable of, and he built a wall wide enough to cover most of the possibilities, even the ones he couldn't name specifically. I want to address something directly that I imagine some of you watching this are wondering about, which is whether I feel any guilt about how publicly this all played out, whether some part of me thinks I should have found a gentler way to handle it, a private conversation instead of a gala stage. I've asked myself this question more times than I can count, in therapy, in the cemetery, in the quiet hours after closing the third location's kitchen at night. The honest answer is that I tried the gentler version first, years earlier, standing in Vanessa's kitchen after the newspaper clipping ran, asking her plainly to stop, and I watched that gentleness get reframed, within minutes, as my own defensiveness, my own inability to share credit graciously. Gentleness, I've come to understand, only functions as a strategy with people who are capable of receiving it as good faith, rather than as an opening to be exploited. Vanessa had shown me, repeatedly, over a decade, exactly which category she fell into, and continuing to extend private, gentle corrections to someone who consistently converted them into public ammunition against me would not have been kindness. It would have been a slower, quieter form of the same harm, just one that took longer to become visible to everyone else. I think, too, about the specific mechanics of forgiveness, because people ask me about that more than almost anything else when they hear this story. Whether I've forgiven Vanessa, whether I plan to. I don't think forgiveness is owed automatically simply because enough time has passed, and I don't think withholding it makes a person bitter or unfinished with their own healing, the way some corners of the internet like to insist. What I've settled into, a year out, is something more specific than forgiveness or its absence. I've stopped being angry at Vanessa as a daily, active feeling, the way I was for the first several months, and what's replaced that anger is something closer to a clear-eyed, permanent recalibration of how much access she gets to my life going forward. Which is very little, carefully bounded, entirely contingent on whether Mason, as he grows, ever needs a version of family continuity I'm willing to provide on his behalf, even though I'm not willing to provide it on hers. That's not forgiveness in the warm, redemptive sense people sometimes want from a story like this. It's something more sustainable, I think, for someone who spent 14 years absorbing costs nobody else in the family bothered to notice. A boundary, held consistently, without the performance of either total reconciliation or total estrangement. Because both of those, I've realized, are still, in their own ways, a kind of story I'd be telling for an audience, and I am, finally, at 43, no longer interested in building my life around what an audience needs from me. I want to spend a little more time on the actual craft of what I do, because I think it matters to this story in a way that goes beyond simple business detail, and because I've noticed, telling this story to people over the past year, that the specific, technical texture of the work is often the part that makes people finally understand why the theft of credit felt as violating as it did. A financier, if you've never made one, is deceptively simple on paper. Browned butter, almond flour, egg whites, sugar, a small amount of regular flour to bind it. The difficulty is entirely in the timing and the heat, in knowing the exact moment brown butter crosses from nutty and fragrant into scorched and bitter, a window that, depending on your stove and your altitude and the specific humidity of an Ohio summer kitchen, might last 90 seconds or might last 4 minutes. And the only way to learn that window is to burn it, repeatedly, dozens of times, until your nose learns to recognize the shift a half second before your eyes would catch it in the pan. I burned that butter more times than I can count in my first year of testing recipes, standing over a 2-burner stove in a rented commercial kitchen I shared with 2 other small businesses, and each failed batch cost real money, ingredients I couldn't always easily replace, hours I didn't have to spare given how many other things a one-person operation required simultaneously. Nobody in my family ever asked to taste a failed batch, curious about what had gone wrong, curious about the actual mechanics of getting it right. The only version of my work anyone in my extended family ever engaged with was the final polished product, arriving already perfect on a dessert table at someone's party, disconnected entirely from the failures that had produced it. Which made it strangely uncomfortably easy for Vanessa over the years to claim proximity to a process she had genuinely never witnessed even once. Because from the outside, a perfect financier looks like something that simply happens, rather than something wrestled into existence through repeated, expensive, largely unwitnessed failure. I think about this, sometimes, as a metaphor for the entire 14 years, though I'm wary of pushing a metaphor too hard in a story that's already asking a lot of you. But there's something true in it. Vanessa only ever showed up for the plated result. Never the burnt butter, never the 4 a.m. mornings, never the $200 lost to a broken thermostat. And it was precisely that absence from the actual difficulty that let her later claim, with a straight face, to have been present for its creation. People who have genuinely done hard, unglamorous work together rarely need to loudly announce their involvement afterward, because the knowledge of what it cost lives in both of them, privately, permanently. People who were never actually present are the ones who need the announcement, because without it, there's no record of them being there at all. And Vanessa, I've come to believe, understood this instinctively, even if she never would have described her own behavior in those terms. The wholesale line's shelf-stable pastry problem, which I mentioned earlier without much detail, deserves a fuller accounting too, because it represents, I think, the single most technically demanding year of my entire career. And it's the year Vanessa's fabricated claim about a fallen-through grocery deal did the most active damage to how my family perceived my actual competence. Shelf-stable pastry, for anyone unfamiliar, requires solving a problem that seems almost contradictory. A laminated dough product needs enough moisture content to taste fresh, and enough structural integrity to survive distribution, refrigerated trucking, and grocery shelf life of 10 to 14 days, without the buttery, flaky texture collapsing into something gummy, or, worse, developing the kind of off flavors that come from moisture migration in packaged baked goods. I spent 5 months alongside the actual contract negotiation, testing 17 different formulations, adjusting hydration ratios, testing 3 different packaging films for their specific oxygen transmission rates, working with a food scientist I hired on a short-term contract basis, a woman named Priya Nair who taught me more about polymer science as it applies to pastry than I ever expected to need to know running a bakery. I solved it, eventually, on the 14th formulation, a modified lamination technique that reduced moisture migration by adjusting the ratio of butter layers without sacrificing the flake structure that made the product recognizably ours, rather than a generic, mass-produced approximation of what we made in the actual stores. That solution is now, 5 years later, the technical foundation of an entire wholesale division that does just under $2 million a year on its own, employing 6 people whose jobs exist specifically because I spent 5 months in 2019 becoming functionally an amateur food scientist out of sheer necessity. My mother's repetition of Vanessa's claim that the grocery deal fell through because Diane wouldn't let anyone else in on it landed, at the time, not just as an insult but as an erasure of 5 months of genuinely difficult, genuinely skilled technical work, replaced with a fictional narrative about my own gatekeeping pettiness. I want that specific erasure on the record too, because I think people sometimes assume the harm in a story like this is limited to money and reputation, when in truth, some of the deepest harm was simply never having my actual competence witnessed accurately by the people who were supposed to know me best. I want to close this out by returning, finally, to the callback I promised you at the beginning, the line Vanessa said at my 35th birthday, dressed up as an affectionate joke, that I dragged myself into baking because I needed something to do with my nervous energy. I've told you already what I said back to her at the gala, the reversal of that line, but I don't think I fully explained, until now, why that particular sentence had lodged so deep in me for 8 years before I finally got to answer it in front of 180 witnesses. The sentence worked when Vanessa first said it, precisely because it contained a small kernel of something almost true, dressed up in a frame that made it sound diminishing rather than accurate. I did have nervous energy as a teenager, as a young woman navigating a household where my mother's attention was a scarce, unevenly distributed resource. Baking did give me somewhere to put that energy, a room in the house where nobody was comparing me to my sister. A set of problems: proofing times, hydration ratios, the exact temperature at which butter crosses from solid to something workable, that had clean, knowable answers in a childhood otherwise full of ambiguous, shifting rules about who deserved what attention and why. Vanessa wasn't wrong that baking started, for me, as a refuge. What she did, that night at my birthday, and for 8 years afterward, every time she repeated some version of that framing, was take an accurate observation about my adolescence and use it to diminish an adult accomplishment, implying that what I'd built was still, essentially, nervous energy with better production values, rather than what it actually was. 14 years of deliberate, skilled, increasingly sophisticated labor that happened to have started, yes, as a refuge, the way a great many meaningful things in a person's life start as refuges before they become vocations. I think about that distinction often now, the difference between where something starts and what it becomes, because I think it's the exact distinction Vanessa's entire 14-year campaign depended on obscuring. She needed everyone, including me, to keep thinking of the gilded whisk as somehow still a teenager's nervous hobby that had simply gotten lucky, rather than a skilled, deliberately built $8 million company, because the moment the family collectively acknowledged what it actually was, an achievement built through specific, learnable, increasingly rare expertise, her own contribution, and by extension her own eventual claim to a piece of it, would have looked as absurd as it actually was. I said what I said to her at the gala, about the nervous energy line, deliberately, because I wanted that specific, years-old diminishment answered in the same public register it had originally been delivered in. She'd said it as a toast, in front of a room, dressed as affection. I answered it as a toast, in front of a much larger room, dressed as fact. I don't know if she understood, in the moment, exactly which sentence I was calling back to. I suspect she did, given the way her face changed, some flicker of recognition underneath the general unraveling of everything else happening around her. I hope she understood it, honestly, because I'd spent 8 years carrying that sentence quietly, and there was something specifically, precisely satisfying about finally getting to set it down exactly where she'd first tried to hand it to me. If you've made it this far into my story, I want to thank you, genuinely, because I know it's been a lot, and I know some of you came for the drama of a birthday party confrontation and stayed for something that turned out to be about grief and marriage and the particular loneliness of being the reliable one in a family that only knows how to reward performance. I hope, if there's a person like Vanessa somewhere in your own life, that you find your own version of the fireproof lockbox, your own Warren Coates insisting on a clause that feels paranoid until the day it isn't. Your own Dolores Reyes willing to keep a promise made in a quiet room, even when keeping it costs her something in a loud one. And I hope, whatever your own version of the burnt honey lavender tart is, whatever quiet, unglamorous thing you've spent years building while nobody in your family thought to ask what it actually cost you, that you get, eventually, the exact room you need to say, calmly, without raising your voice, exactly what's actually true. Because here's what I know now, standing in a kitchen I built myself. In a business that carries my late husband's careful, quiet protection woven into its legal bones. 9 months after burying him, and a year after watching my sister's decade of fabrications collapse in front of 180 witnesses, the people who spend years documenting instead of performing are very often mistaken, for a long time, for the boring half of the story. They are never, in the end, actually boring. They are simply patient, in a way that terrifies people who've built their entire lives on being believed, without ever having to prove anything. My sister showed up to my husband's burial reception and tried to take half of everything I'd built with a folded piece of paper and a rehearsed tremor in her voice. She left the anniversary gala with nothing but the truth finally catching up to her. In a room she couldn't spin, in front of everyone who'd ever believed her. I still have half a lemon financier waiting in a container in my kitchen right now. Actually, made fresh this morning before I sat down to finally tell you all of this properly. Comment below if you want to know exactly what happened when my mother tried, 6 weeks after the gala, to bring Vanessa to a small dinner honoring Sophia's culinary school graduation, without asking me first, because that particular story, the one about boundaries held firm the second time instead of the first, might be the one that actually finishes teaching you everything my sister never learned. Subscribe if you want to be here when I tell it, and tell me, honestly, in the comments, if it had been you standing at that dessert table, fork halfway to your mouth, would you have said, "Ah, all right," or would you have said something else entirely? There's one last thread I want to pull all the way through before I let this rest, because I think it answers a question a lot of you are probably still holding. What actually happened to the framed newspaper clipping? The one that hung in Vanessa's hallway for 6 years, greeting every guest who walked through her front door with a caption that named her, "My early business partner." I didn't ask her to take it down. I didn't send a letter through Warren demanding it. I simply mentioned, once, to my mother, in an offhand way, that I'd love a copy of the original correction the paper had run, the small one, on page 9, that almost nobody had read. My mother, in one of the small, imperfect gestures of reckoning she's continued to make since the gala, took a photograph of that correction, framed it herself, and drove it over to Vanessa's new apartment, unprompted, and left it in her mailbox with a short note that simply said, "For accuracy." I don't know if Vanessa ever hung it anywhere. I don't especially need to know. What I know is that the 6 years that clipping spent uncorrected on her wall no longer represents an active, ongoing theft, just a historical one, filed away now alongside everything else Warren's folder made undeniable in a room full of witnesses who will not soon forget what they watched happen there. I think in the end about what I'd actually want someone in my position to know, someone sitting right now in the exact spot I sat in for 14 years, watching a sibling or a parent or an in-law slowly, patiently construct a version of your life's work that erases the actual labor and inserts their own convenient proximity to it. I'd want them to know that the impulse to correct every small lie in real time, exhausting as it is to resist, is sometimes the wrong instinct, not because the lies don't matter, but because some battles are only winnable once, decisively, in the right room, with the right proof, rather than fought in 100 small, deniable skirmishes that never quite add up to a verdict. I'd want them to know that documentation, boring and paranoid feeling as it seems in the moment, is a form of self-respect disguised as administrative habit, and that the people who love you best, like Richard did, will often build you defenses you don't yet know you need, quietly, years in advance, simply because they've learned to recognize the shape of a threat before it has fully formed. And I'd want them to know, more than anything else, that the reliable one, the quiet one, the one who doesn't need anything, the one everyone assumes can absorb one more small theft of credit without complaint, because she's absorbed so many already, is very often sitting on more proof, more patience, and more capacity for a decisive, well-timed reckoning than anyone in the room has bothered to imagine. My sister spent 14 years building a story about who I was. I spent 14 years building an actual company, a real marriage, a genuine body of skilled work, and a fireproof lockbox full of the truth. And when the moment finally came to choose which of those two things the world would believe, it turned out the truth, patiently assembled, always wins the room the lie was counting on controlling. That's the whole of it. That's what happened when I buried my husband, attended my nephew's first birthday, heard my sister demand half of everything I'd built, and said calmly, over a fork of lemon cake, "Ah, all right." Because I already knew, even then, exactly how this story was going to end, and it was never, not for one single second, going to end the way she'd rehearsed it in her bathroom mirror the night before. I keep thinking, even now, about one more small detail from that gala night that I never got around to mentioning, because it happened after almost everyone had gone home, after Vanessa and Gary and Mason had left, after my mother's imperfect question at the corner table, after Warren had packed his folder back into his briefcase, and Dolores had hugged me twice at the door before heading out into the cool night air. I stood alone, for a few minutes, in the middle of that converted textile mill, under the 22-foot ceilings and the same string lights we'd used for a decade of other people's weddings, and I looked at the burnt honey lavender tart, most of it gone by then, just a few slices left under the glass dome, and I thought about how strange it was that the thing everyone would remember about that night was Dolores's testimony, or Warren's documents, or the exact moment Vanessa's face changed. when the thing I would actually remember most, standing there alone in the quiet aftermath, was the tart itself. 3 attempts, 2 in the middle of the night, 1 perfect. The culmination of 14 years of learning exactly how long lavender needs to steep in cream before it turns from floral into something that tastes, unmistakably, like a specific, hard-won kind of peace. I locked up that night myself, the way I'd locked up every location I'd ever opened, checking the ovens, wiping down the last counter, turning off the string lights section by section until the room went dark except for the exit signs, and I drove home alone, windows down despite the October chill, because I wanted the cold air on my face the whole way, wanted to feel something sharp and real and entirely mine after a night that had, in its own complicated way, belonged to everyone in that room as much as it belonged to me. I got home, let myself into a house that still, 9 months later, held Richard's reading glasses on the nightstand exactly where he'd left them, and I did not cry that night. Not out of the same practiced withholding Dr. Chandrasekharan would later help me name and question, but out of something closer to genuine, uncomplicated relief, the kind that doesn't need tears to register as real. I slept better that night than I had in 11 weeks. I woke up the next morning, a Sunday, and I did the only thing that has ever actually made sense to me on a morning after something enormous has happened. I went into the kitchen, and I started, from nothing, testing a new recipe. A spiced pear galette I'd been meaning to develop for the fall menu, because the truest, most permanent thing about who I am, underneath the widow, underneath the sister, underneath the woman who finally stood up in front of 180 people and said what was true, is simply this: I am a person who bakes. I always have been. I always will be. Nothing my sister said, and nothing she was ultimately forced to admit, in front of anyone, ever changed that, because it was never actually hers to take in the first place, no matter how many years she spent, patiently, quietly, convincing an entire family otherwise. That galette, if you're curious, made it onto the fall menu 3 weeks later. It's still there now. I make the first batch of the season myself, every year, alone, early in the morning, before anyone else arrives, the same way I've started almost everything that has ever mattered in my life, quietly, with my own 2 hands, long before anyone else in the room thinks to ask what it's going to cost me to build it. If you take one thing from everything I've told you tonight, let it be this: keep your own records, in whatever form your own life requires, not because you expect the worst from the people you love, but because love and vigilance were never actually opposites. Not for Richard, not for Dolores, not for me. The people who plan quietly for the possibility of betrayal are not the cynics of a family. They are, more often than anyone gives them credit for, the ones who end up protecting everyone else's version of the truth long after they're gone. I think about Warren's line often, the one about hope not being a legal strategy, because I've come to believe it applies to almost every relationship in a family that runs on unspoken rules instead of stated ones. Hope that a sister will eventually stop exaggerating on her own is not a strategy. Hope that a mother will one day choose truth over comfortable silence is not a strategy. Hope that a cousin will slow down long enough to check a story before repeating it is not a strategy. The only strategy that ever actually protected me, across 14 years of small thefts and one enormous one, was the unglamorous, patient work of writing things down, keeping receipts, saving screenshots, and trusting that a day would come when all of it, assembled quietly and without anger, would matter more than any performance anyone else was capable of delivering in a louder room. That day came. I was ready for it, because a dying man taught me, in his final act of love, that readiness is its own quiet inheritance, worth infinitely more than anything my sister ever tried to take. So no, I don't regret the folding table, the box truck, the 4 a.m. mornings nobody witnessed, or the 14 years I spent quietly building a life my family mistook for a hobby, right up until the night it became impossible to mistake for anything but exactly what it was. I built it. I proved it. And I will keep building, every single morning, in a kitchen that finally, fully, belongs to no one's story but my own. If you're the reliable one in your own family right now, the one everyone assumes doesn't need thanking because you never once asked for it, I hope you hear me clearly. Document what you build, protect what you love before you think you need to, and never let anyone convince you that your silence about your own worth is the same thing as humility. It isn't. It's just a debt you're allowed, finally, to stop extending on credit. Somewhere out there tonight, someone else is sitting through a family dinner, listening to a story about their own life get quietly rewritten by someone who was never actually in the room when it mattered. I hope, when their moment finally comes, they get the room they need, the proof they've kept, and the calm, unshaken voice to say exactly what's true. The same way I finally got mine, 9 months after burying the one person who spent 13 years making sure I would. That's the story, start to finish, exactly as it happened, and I felt every single person watching deserved to hear it in full, rather than in the fragments that already made the rounds online. Thank you for staying with me through all of it, the grief and the ledger and the lemon cake, and thank you especially for the version of yourselves that showed up ready to believe a widow over a rehearsed performance. Because that belief, extended to a total stranger on the internet, is exactly the kind of thing my own family took 14 years to learn how to offer me for free. See you in the next one, and remember, comment below, tell me where you're watching from, and tell me honestly whether you'd have said, all right, too. And if there's someone in your life right now quietly building something real while somebody else quietly plans to claim credit for it later, send them this video tonight, before their own version of that folding table ever arrives. Because the truth, once it's properly documented and properly witnessed, never actually needs to be loud. It only needs the one right room and the patience to wait for it. Take care of yourselves this week, hold on to your receipts, and I'll talk to you soon. You already know what I'd tell you to do if it happens to you. Write it down, wait for your room, say it calmly. That's it. That's everything. All right. Good night, and thank you again for watching this all the way through with me tonight. Every word of it was true, and every bit of proof still sits safely in a fireproof box in my closet. Always will. Yes,